Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. Now let's get into the case. The morning air carried a crisp September chill as Professor Alan Winters loaded the last of his equipment into the back of the university's mud-spattered Ford Expedition. The vehicle, once white, but now permanently stained with the red clay of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, had seen better days. Alan checked his watch, 5:47 a.m., and took a deep breath of the pre-dawn air. Perfect timing. He wanted to be at his research site by sunrise to maximize the day's work. At 43, Alan had the weathered look of someone who spent more time outdoors than in. His sandy brown hair was beginning to gray at the temples, and crow's feet had formed at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting in the sun. 15 years as an ecology professor at Northern Michigan University had earned him a reputation as one of the foremost experts on northern hardwood forest ecosystems. It had also earned him a chronic sunburn on the back of his neck and a collection of scars from various field mishaps, a hazard of the profession he wore with quiet pride. The Huron Mountain Research Area, where Alan conducted his fieldwork, was a pristine stretch of old-growth forest about an hour northwest of Marquette. The 18,000-acre tract was one of the few remaining pieces of untouched wilderness in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, preserved through a combination of private conservation efforts and its remote location. For the past 3 years, Alan had been studying the soil microbiome of the forest and its relationship to climate change resilience, work that had recently earned him a substantial NSF grant and allowed him to expand his research team. Alan closed the expedition's rear hatch and looked toward the small cluster of cabins where his research assistants were still sleeping. He'd let them rest. Today's preliminary work was something he preferred to do alone anyway, setting up the new sensor array and collecting the first samples from the expanded study area. The team would join him tomorrow for the real heavy lifting. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the university's field station. The headlights cut through the morning darkness as he navigated the winding dirt road that led deeper into the forest. The radio picked up nothing but static this far from town, so Alan drove in silence, mentally reviewing his sampling protocol. 40 minutes later, Alan turned onto the narrow access road that led to his primary research site. He'd selected this particular tract of forest 3 years ago for its representative mix of sugar maple, yellow birch, and eastern hemlock, the characteristic species of a northern hardwood forest. More importantly, it had remained relatively undisturbed by both human activity and natural disasters for over a century, making it an ideal place to study long-term ecological processes. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten as Alan parked the expedition at the small clearing that served as an informal trailhead. He grabbed his backpack, field notebook, and sampling kit from the passenger seat. After a moment's consideration, he reached into the glove compartment and took out a canister of bear spray, clipping it to his belt. Black bears were common in the area, though Alan had only spotted them a handful of times during his years of fieldwork. They generally avoided humans, but it never hurt to be prepared. The hike to his research plots was about a mile along a barely discernible trail that Alan himself had worn into the forest floor over countless trips. He moved efficiently, his boots crunching through the leaf litter as dawn broke through the canopy in dappled patterns. The air was alive with morning sounds, chickadees and nuthatches calling from the branches, a distant woodpecker drumming, the occasional rustle of small mammals in the underbrush. Alan reached his first research plot just as the sun cleared the treetops. It was a 20-meter by 20-meter square, marked at the corners with metal stakes and flagging tape. Inside the plot, Alan had previously mapped every tree, shrub, and fallen log, creating a detailed inventory of the vegetation. The real focus of his work, however, lay beneath the surface. He set down his pack and took out the soil sampling equipment, a small auger, collection tubes, labels, and a field thermometer. Alan's research centered on how soil microbiomes, the complex communities of bacteria, fungi, and other microscopic organisms that lived in the soil, responded to changes in temperature and moisture. These tiny organisms played a crucial role in forest health, breaking down organic matter and making nutrients available to plants. Understanding how they might react to a changing climate was essential for predicting the future of northern forests. Alan knelt on the ground and began the methodical process of collecting samples. For each one, he carefully removed the leaf litter, took a temperature reading, and then drilled the auger into the soil to extract a core sample that he transferred to a labeled tube. Each sample site was meticulously documented in his field notebook and marked with GPS coordinates. The work was painstaking but satisfying. This was what Alan loved most about his job, being alone in the forest, hands in the dirt, piecing together the intricate relationships that made the ecosystem function. In the lab, these samples would be analyzed for microbial diversity, enzyme activity, carbon content, and a dozen other parameters. But here in the field, it was just Alan and the forest engaged in a quiet conversation. By mid-morning, Alan had completed sampling at the original research plot and was ready to move to the new area he'd identified for the expanded study. It was about a quarter-mile to the east, in a section of forest that included a small seasonal stream, a slightly different microhabitat that would add valuable variation to his dataset. He packed up his equipment and headed toward the new site, moving off the familiar path and into less traveled terrain. The forest here was denser, with more understory vegetation, requiring Alan to occasionally push through thickets of young maple saplings and wild raspberry canes. He checked his GPS occasionally to stay on course, though years in these woods had given him a good sense of direction. The new research site was in a slight depression, where the land sloped gently toward the stream. The soil here would be richer, with higher moisture content, potentially supporting a more diverse microbial community. Alan made mental notes of the vegetation differences he observed as he approached. More ferns, a few yellow birches that had reached massive proportions, patches of wild leeks whose leaves had already died back for the season. As he reached the area where he planned to establish the new plot, Alan noticed something odd. Some of the understory vegetation had been trampled, and a small sapling was broken about halfway up its trunk. Animal activity was nothing unusual in the forest, but this looked recent and fairly extensive. He scanned the area more carefully and spotted what appeared to be scratch marks on a large birch tree, vertical lines where the outer bark had been stripped away. Alan felt a slight prickle of awareness at the back of his neck. These were signs of black bear activity. The scratching on trees was a common territorial marking behavior, and the trampled vegetation could indicate a feeding area. Black bears were omnivorous, with their diet consisting largely of berries, nuts, and plants, supplemented occasionally by insects or carrion. It wasn't unexpected to find bear sign in these woods, but Alan made a mental note to be especially alert. He decided to proceed with establishing the research plot, but kept the bear spray within easy reach. Alan took out the metal stakes and began measuring and marking the corners of the new plot. The work required focus, as he used a compass to ensure the square was properly aligned with the cardinal directions. After placing the first 2 corner stakes, he unspooled a measuring tape to locate the position for the third corner. It was then that Alan heard it, a distinctive huffing sound followed by the crack of a branch breaking. He froze, measuring tape still in hand, and slowly turned toward the noise. About 30 yards away, partially obscured by a stand of young hemlocks, stood a black bear. It was on all fours, head raised, clearly aware of Alan's presence. Even at that distance, Alan could tell it was a good-sized animal, probably weighing around 300 pounds, a healthy adult male. Alan's mind raced through the proper protocol for bear encounters. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. Speak in a calm, firm voice. "Hey, bear," he said, keeping his tone steady and authoritative. "I see you there. I'm just going to move along now." The bear huffed again and took a step forward, swinging its head from side to side, a sign of agitation or uncertainty. Alan raised his arms to appear larger and continued speaking, hoping to define himself clearly as a human and not a potential prey item. Black bears rarely attacked humans, but they could become defensive if surprised or if they felt cornered. "I'm moving away now, bear. This is your space. I respect that." Alan began to back up slowly, maintaining visual contact with the bear while trying to put more distance between them. The bear remained where it was, seemingly assessing the situation. This was normal behavior, and Alan felt the initial spike of adrenaline begin to subside. If he could back away to a safe distance, the bear would likely lose interest or move off. But as Alan continued his careful retreat, disaster struck. His heel caught on the partially exposed root of a large maple, sending him stumbling backward. He fought to regain his balance, arms windmilling, but his heavy backpack shifted, pulling him off center. Alan fell hard, landing on his back atop his pack. The air knocked from his lungs. Worse, the metal sampling equipment inside the pack made a loud clanging sound as it struck against itself, a sudden, threatening noise in the quiet forest. The bear's reaction was immediate. It dropped to all fours and charged. Everything happened with terrifying speed. Alan scrambled to right himself, reaching desperately for the bear spray at his belt. The bear covered the distance between them with shocking quickness, moving with the fluid grace of a predator despite its bulk. Alan managed to get to his knees just as the bear reached him. He raised his arm in a defensive gesture, but it was too late to deploy the spray. The bear swatted at him with a massive paw, connecting with Alan's raised left arm. The blow was powerful enough to spin Alan around and knock him back to the ground. Pain exploded through his forearm, and he felt rather than heard the snap of bone. The force of the impact sent the bear spray flying from his belt into the underbrush. Alan rolled onto his back, trying to protect his face and neck. The bear loomed over him, close enough that Alan could smell its musty odor and feel its hot breath. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. Alan recognized the reality of his situation with crystalline clarity. He was alone in the woods, more than a mile from his vehicle, facing a powerful wild animal with no weapon and a broken arm. His chances of survival suddenly seemed very slim. The bear lunged forward again. Alan kicked out instinctively, his boot connecting with the bear's shoulder. It was like kicking a brick wall, and the impact sent a shock of pain up his leg. The bear seemed more annoyed than deterred. It made a guttural sound, something between a grunt and a growl, and swiped at Alan's legs. Claws raked through his right pants leg, tearing into the flesh of his thigh. The pain was immediate and intense, a burning sensation, followed by the warm wetness of blood. Alan cried out, a primal sound of pain and fear that echoed through the forest. The bear backed up slightly, perhaps startled by the loud noise, then approached again more cautiously. Alan knew he had only seconds to act. With his good arm, he fumbled at his belt for anything that might help. His fingers closed around his field knife, a small 4-inch blade used for collecting plant samples. A pathetically inadequate weapon against a bear, but it was all he had. He pulled out the knife just as the bear made another lunge. Acting on pure instinct, Alan thrust the blade forward. He felt it connect and sink into something solid, though he couldn't tell where he'd struck the animal. The bear made a loud, pained sound and reared back. For a brief moment, Alan thought the small injury might drive the bear away, but instead, it seemed to intensify the animal's aggression. The bear came at him with renewed fury, jaws open. Alan raised his injured arm in a desperate attempt to protect his throat and felt the bear's teeth sink into his forearm. The pain was beyond anything Alan had ever experienced, a white-hot explosion that consumed his entire consciousness. He screamed again, unable to control the response. The bear shook its head, worrying Alan's arm like a dog with a bone. Each movement sent waves of agony through Alan's body. He felt himself growing light-headed, the edges of his vision beginning to darken. Some distant part of his mind recognized that he was going into shock. Then suddenly a new sound cut through the forest, a high-pitched electronic wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The bear released Alan's arm and backed away, clearly startled by the unfamiliar noise. The sound continued, a piercing shriek that hurt Alan's ears, even through the haze of pain and shock. Through blurred vision, Alan saw a figure moving quickly through the trees toward him. The bear hesitated, caught between its attack and this new threat. The figure raised something above its head, a bright orange object, and the electronic wail intensified. "Get away from him!" a voice shouted. The bear huffed and paced sideways, still agitated but now uncertain. The figure continued to approach, waving the orange object and making the noise. Finally, the bear turned and lumbered quickly into the forest, disappearing among the trees with surprising speed for such a large animal. Alan lay on the ground, breathing in shallow gasps, trying to remain conscious. The figure rushed to his side and knelt beside him. Through the fog of pain, Alan recognized Jessica Chen, one of his graduate research assistants, holding an air horn in her hand. "Professor Winters." "Oh my God." Jessica's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Professor, can you hear me?" Alan, trying to speak, but could only manage a pained groan. Jessica set down the air horn and quickly assessed his injuries. Her face, normally composed and serious, was pale with shock. "Don't try to move," she said, pulling off her backpack. "I'm going to call for help and try to stop the bleeding." Alan nodded weakly. He watched as Jessica took out her satellite phone, standard equipment for researchers working in remote areas with no cell coverage. While she made the call, speaking urgently to the emergency dispatcher, Alan fought to stay conscious, focusing on his breathing and trying to take stock of his injuries. His left arm was clearly broken, the forearm bent at an unnatural angle. The bear's teeth had punctured the flesh in several places, leaving deep, ragged wounds that bled freely. His right thigh was slashed open with 4 parallel cuts, where the bear's claws had torn through skin and muscle. Various other bruises and smaller cuts covered his body from being knocked to the ground. The pain was overwhelming, coming in waves that threatened to push him into unconsciousness. Jessica finished her call and knelt beside him again. "Help is on the way," she said, her voice steadier now as her emergency response training kicked in. "They're sending a helicopter, but it will take about 40 minutes to reach us. I need to control the bleeding and immobilize your arm." She opened her first aid kit and pulled out gauze pads, bandages, and a small bottle of antiseptic. "This is going to hurt," she warned, "but I need to clean these wounds as best I can." Alan gritted his teeth as Jessica poured antiseptic over the claw marks on his thigh. The liquid burned like fire, but he knew infection was a serious risk with animal-inflicted wounds. Jessica worked efficiently, applying pressure to the worst of the bleeding and then bandaging the wounds as tightly as she dared. "What are you doing here?" Alan managed to ask between pained gasps as she worked on his leg. Jessica glanced up at him, her hands steady despite the stress of the situation. "I came out early to help set up the new site. I was trying to call you on the radio, but you weren't answering, so I decided to hike in." She secured the bandage around his thigh and moved to his injured arm. "I heard you scream." Alan closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed with gratitude. If Jessica hadn't decided to come out early, if she hadn't brought the air horn, if she hadn't heard his cries for help, he pushed the thoughts away. Focusing on the terrifying what-ifs wouldn't help the situation. "Thank you," he said simply. Jessica nodded, her attention on his mangled forearm. "I'm going to have to immobilize this before we try to move you. I don't have a proper splint." But she looked around and spotted the metal stakes Alan had been using to mark the research plot. "Those will work." She retrieved 2 of the stakes and returned to Alan's side, using strips torn from her own shirt and the stakes as makeshift splints. She carefully immobilized his broken arm. Every movement sent spikes of pain through Alan, but he bit back his cries, focusing instead on Jessica's calm, methodical approach to the crisis. "The dispatcher said we shouldn't move you unless absolutely necessary," Jessica said after finishing with the splint. "The helicopter will land in the clearing where we parked the vehicles, and they'll send in a team with a stretcher. All we need to do is keep you stable until they arrive." Alan nodded weakly. The initial adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him shaking and increasingly aware of the full extent of his injuries. The pain was like nothing he'd experienced before, but even worse was the creeping cold that seemed to be spreading from his extremities. He recognized the symptoms of shock setting in. "I'm cold," he said, his voice thin and strained. Jessica immediately shrugged out of her jacket and laid it over him. "That's shock," she said. "Try to stay with me, Professor. Talk to me about something. Tell me about what you were planning to do here today." Alan understood what she was doing, keeping him conscious and focused. He made an effort to organize his thoughts. "New research plot," he managed, extending the study to include the riparian zone, different soil moisture, different microbial communities. Jessica nodded encouragingly. "That's good. And what were you hoping to find?" Alan continued the effort, explaining his research methodology in halting sentences. The technical details of his work provided a fragile lifeline to focus on, something familiar to distract from the pain and growing weakness. Jessica kept him talking, asking questions about the project, the methods, anything to keep his mind engaged. Time stretched strangely. What felt like hours to Alan was in reality only about 30 minutes before they heard the distant thump of helicopter rotors. Jessica stood and waved the bright orange air horn above her head, though they were well hidden under the forest canopy. "I'm going to set off a flare," she told Alan, taking a small emergency flare from her pack. "They might not be able to see us under these trees, but this will let them know roughly where we are." She moved a short distance away, aimed the flare through a gap in the canopy, and fired. The bright red streak shot upward, bursting above the treetops in a brilliant flash. The next 20 minutes were a blur for Alan. The rescue team, 2 paramedics and a Forest Service officer, arrived with a stretcher and more advanced medical supplies. They administered IV fluids, gave him morphine for the pain, and properly dressed his wounds before carefully transferring him to the stretcher. The journey back to the helicopter was agonizing, despite the pain medication. Every bump and jostle sent fresh waves of pain through Alan's damaged body. He focused on the canopy above, the shifting patterns of sunlight through leaves, trying to disassociate from the physical ordeal. At the clearing, the helicopter waited, rotors turning slowly. Alan had a brief impression of organized chaos as he was loaded into the aircraft. Jessica squeezed his good hand before stepping back. "I'll follow in the expedition," she shouted over the noise of the rotors. "I'll meet you at the hospital." Then the helicopter lifted off, the sensation of movement making Alan's stomach lurch. One of the paramedics leaned over him, checking his vital signs and adjusting the IV. "You're going to be okay," the paramedic said, though his expression was grave. "We're taking you to Marquette. They have a trauma center there, just hang in there." Alan tried to nod, but the combination of pain, shock, and medication was making it increasingly difficult to stay conscious. The last thing he remembered was the vibration of the helicopter and the paramedic's voice, distant and echoing, asking him to stay awake. Then darkness claimed him. When Alan regained consciousness, he was in a hospital room. The steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell told him that much before he even opened his eyes. When he did, he found himself staring at a white ceiling with fluorescent lights. His body felt oddly distant, wrapped in a cocoon of pain medication that muffled but couldn't completely eliminate the throbbing ache of his injuries. "Welcome back, Dr. Winters." Alan turned his head slightly to see a woman in a white coat standing beside his bed, checking one of the monitors. She was in her 50s with short grey hair and wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Dr. Levine," she said. "You're at UP Health System in Marquette. You were brought in by helicopter yesterday after a bear attack." Yesterday? Alan tried to process this. He'd lost an entire day. "How bad?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. Dr. Levine picked up a cup of water with a straw from the bedside table and held it to his lips. Alan drank gratefully, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. "You've sustained significant injuries," Dr. Levine said after he'd finished drinking. Her tone was professional but compassionate. "The most serious is a compound fracture of your left radius and ulna, both bones in your forearm. You underwent surgery to repair the fracture and clean the wound. The bear's teeth caused considerable soft tissue damage and introduced bacteria, so we're particularly concerned about infection." She continued her assessment, detailing his injuries with clinical precision. "You also have 4 deep lacerations on your right thigh from the bear's claws. They required 27 stitches in total. Fortunately, no major blood vessels were severed, though there is muscle damage that will require physical therapy. You have multiple contusions, a mild concussion, and you lost enough blood to require a transfusion." Alan listened, trying to absorb the information through the fog of pain medication. He lifted his left arm slightly and saw it was encased in a heavy cast from just below his elbow to his fingertips. "How long will I be here?" he asked. "At least a week, Doctor," Levine replied. "The orthopedic surgeon will want to monitor the arm to ensure there's no infection developing. Animal bites are particularly prone to complications. After discharge, you'll need follow-up appointments, antibiotics, and physical therapy. Recovery will be a matter of months, not weeks." Alan nodded, letting the reality of his situation sink in. Months of recovery, his research season effectively over, grant deadlines looming with work uncompleted. "There are some people very anxious to see you, Doctor," Levine added. "Your research assistant, Jessica Chen, I believe, has been here since you were brought in, and the police and wildlife officials would like to take your statement when you're up to it." "Jessica can come in," Alan said. The thought of being questioned by officials made him weary, but he owed Jessica more than he could express. Dr. Levine nodded. "I'll let her know. I'll come back to check on you in a few hours. The pain medication button is by your right hand if you need it. Don't hesitate to use it. Staying ahead of the pain is important for recovery." After the doctor left, Alan lay still, trying to piece together the events that had led him here. The memories were fragmented but intense. The bear's sudden appearance, the fall, the terrifying speed of the attack, the pain, and Jessica's timely arrival with the air horn. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock at the door and Jessica entered. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her normally neat black hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She carried a small potted plant, some kind of fern, which she set on the windowsill before approaching the bed. "Professor Winters," she said, her relief evident. "You're awake. Thanks to you," Alan replied. "Jessica, I can't even begin to thank you enough. You saved my life." She shook her head, embarrassed by the praise. "I'm just glad I decided to come out early and that I grabbed the air horn from the equipment shed. Standard safety protocol, right?" Alan smiled weakly. "Right, though I think we might need to revisit those protocols." Jessica pulled a chair up to the bedside and sat down. "The others are here too, Marcus and Delia. They're in the waiting room. We've been taking shifts." "You should all go back to the station," Alan said. "There's nothing you can do here and you shouldn't put the research on hold." Jessica gave him a look that clearly said she thought he was being ridiculous. "The research can wait. Besides, We need your guidance on how to proceed. And someone needed to contact the university. Deal with the authorities and make sure your family was notified. Family? The word triggered a sudden concern. Did someone call Sarah? He asked, thinking of his ex-wife. They had remained on relatively good terms after their divorce 3 years ago, co-parenting their 16-year-old daughter Emma, who lived primarily with Sarah in Ann Arbor. Jessica nodded. The hospital called her as your emergency contact. She's driving up with Emma. They should be here later today. Alan closed his eyes briefly. Sarah would be worried sick, and Emma. He hated the thought of his daughter seeing him like this. But a larger part of him longed for their presence, for the comfort of family in the aftermath of such a traumatic experience. What about the authorities? He asked, opening his eyes again. Dr. Levine mentioned they want to speak with me. Jessica shifted in her chair. Yes, there's a conservation officer from the DNR who's investigating the attack, and a sheriff's deputy took preliminary statements from me yesterday. They're treating it very seriously. Alan nodded. Bear attacks were rare in Michigan, and wildlife officials would want a complete record of the incident, both for their records and to determine if the bear posed an ongoing threat to humans. There's something else you should know, Jessica added, her expression becoming more guarded. Someone from the local newspaper has been calling. They've heard about the attack and want to run a story. I didn't give them any details, but it's news, Alan finished for her. Local professor mauled by bear. Makes for a good headline. I can keep telling them no comment, Jessica offered. Alan sighed. No, it's fine. If they want a statement, I'll give them one. Better to have accurate information out there than rumors. He shifted slightly in the bed, wincing as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his injuries despite the medication. When did the doctor say the officials could come by? She said maybe this afternoon if you're up to it. Jessica stood up. I should let you rest. And I'll tell Marcus and Delia they can visit briefly if that's okay. They've been really worried. Alan nodded. Send them in. But Jessica, after that, I want all of you to go back to the field station and get some real rest. You've done more than enough. After Jessica left, Alan lay back against the pillows, the conversation having depleted what little energy he had. His injuries throbbed beneath the dulling blanket of pain medication. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. He would be hospitalized for at least a week, followed by months of recovery and physical therapy. His research would be delayed, possibly compromised, and there would be questions from the university, from funding agencies, from the media. But beneath all these practical concerns lay something deeper and more unsettling, a profound shaking of his confidence. Alan had spent most of his adult life in the wilderness. He respected nature's power, but had always felt at home in the forest, comfortable with the risks inherent in his work. Now, for the first time, he found himself wondering if he could ever feel that sense of ease again. The thought was still troubling him when there was another knock at the door and Marcus and Delia entered. Marcus was a tall, lanky PhD student with a close-cropped beard and perpetually disheveled appearance. Delia, an undergraduate research assistant, was petite with bright red hair and freckles. Both looked anxious as they approached the bed. Hey, Dr. Winters, Marcus said, his usual breezy confidence subdued. How are you feeling? Like I lost an argument with a bear, Alan replied, attempting a weak joke to put them at ease. It worked, somewhat. Both students smiled, though the concern remained evident in their eyes. We were so worried, Delia said. Jessica told us what happened. It sounds terrifying. Alan nodded, not wanting to dwell on the details. It was, but I'm alive, thanks. To Jessica's quick thinking, he shifted the conversation. How are things at the field station? Marcus glanced at Delia before responding. Everything's secure. We locked up your samples in the refrigerator. I moved the expedition back to the station after Jessica got a ride to the hospital with one of the sheriff's deputies. And we've been fielding calls, Delia added. Dr. Patterson from the department called to check on you, and someone from the dean's office. We told them what we knew, which wasn't much. Alan appreciated their efforts. Thank you both. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you joined the research team. Are you kidding? Marcus said, some of his usual energy returning. This is going to make one hell of an acknowledgement in my dissertation. Special thanks to Dr. Winters, who nearly died to advance the cause of soil science. Marcus, Delia elbowed him sharply, but Alan chuckled, grateful for the moment of normalcy. It's fine, Delia. Gallows humor is a time-honored academic tradition. He looked at them both more seriously. Listen, I need you all to continue the work while I'm recovering. Jessica knows the protocols. Stick to the established research plots for now. Don't try to set up the new site, and always work in pairs, no exceptions. Both students nodded solemnly, the implications of his words clear. If Alan had been with a partner, the attack might have been avoided entirely, or at least been less severe. They chatted for a few more minutes about practical matters, equipment that needed maintenance, a department meeting Alan would miss, a deadline for a progress report on the grant. The normalcy of these concerns was somehow comforting, a reminder that life would continue despite this interruption. After they left, promising to return the next day, Alan dozed fitfully. The pain medication made him drowsy, but true sleep eluded him. Every time he started to drift off, he would jerk awake, his mind replaying the attack in vivid detail, the bear's huffing breath, the sensation of claws tearing through flesh, the bone-deep pain of the bite. He was still in this half-conscious state when there was another knock at the door. A man in the uniform of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources entered, followed by a sheriff's deputy. The DNR officer was middle-aged, with a weathered outdoor complexion not unlike Alan's own. The deputy was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with a military short haircut and a notebook in hand. "Dr. Winters, I'm Conservation Officer Mike Daniels with the DNR," the older man said. "And this is Deputy Carson from the Marquette County Sheriff's Department. We'd like to ask you some questions about the bear attack, if you're feeling up to it." Alan nodded and attempted to adjust his position to something more upright, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. Of course, Officer Daniels pulled up a chair while Deputy Carson remained standing, notebook open. "First, let me say I'm sorry this happened to you," Daniels began. "Bear attacks are rare in Michigan, which is why we need to document this incident thoroughly. Can you tell us exactly what occurred, in your own words?" Alan recounted the events as clearly as he could remember them, arriving at the research site, noticing the signs of bear activity, the bear's appearance, his attempt to back away, the fall that seemed to trigger the bear's aggressive response, and finally the attack itself. He described the bear as best he could: adult male, approximately 300 pounds, no distinctive markings. Officer Daniels nodded as he listened, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. "From what you're describing, it sounds like a defensive attack rather than predatory behavior. The bear likely perceived you as a threat after you fell and made that loud noise with your equipment. That's consistent with what I understand." "About black bear behavior," Alan agreed. "It didn't stalk me or approach stealthily, it only charged after I fell." "Did you have any food with you?" Daniels asked. "Anything that might have attracted the bear?" Alan shook his head. "Just water. And a granola bar, both sealed in my backpack. I hadn't opened either." The officer made a note. "And you mentioned you used a knife during the attack?" "Yes," Alan said, the memory making him shudder slightly. "My field knife, small 4-inch blade. I think I managed to stab the bear with it, but I'm not sure where I hit it." This detail seemed to particularly interest Officer Daniels. "That's helpful to know. If we locate the bear, a fresh knife wound would help us confirm it's the one involved in the attack." "Are you going to try to find it?" Alan asked. Daniels nodded. "We've already sent a team to the area. Your research assistant showed us the location yesterday. We've set up a few traps and trail cameras. If the bear is still in the vicinity, there's a good chance we'll be able to locate it. And if you do..." Alan wasn't sure what he wanted the answer to be. Officer Daniels's expression turned grave. "Standard protocol for a bear that has attacked a human is euthanasia, I'm afraid. Once a bear has demonstrated aggressive behavior toward humans, the risk of repeat incidents is considered too high." Alan felt a complicated mix of emotions at this news. On one level, he understood the policy. Public safety had to be the priority. But as an ecologist who had dedicated his career to understanding and protecting natural systems, the thought of an animal being killed because of an encounter he had inadvertently provoked was troubling. "Is there no alternative?" he asked. "Relocation, perhaps?" Officer Daniels shook his head. "Relocation has a poor success rate with problem bears. They often find their way back to their original territory, or they bring their problematic behaviors to the new location. And in a case involving a serious injury like yours, the policy is pretty clear." Deputy Carson, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the conversation, spoke up. "Dr. Winters, from a law enforcement perspective, we need to determine if there was any violation of wildlife regulations or park rules that might have contributed to this incident. Were you aware of any specific warnings about bear activity in the area?" "No specific warnings," Alan replied, "but black bears are common throughout the Upper Peninsula. Their presence is a known factor for anyone working in these forests. I was following standard precautions. I had bear spray, though I wasn't able to use it once the attack began." The deputy nodded and made another note. "And the research area, is it public land or private property. It's part of the Huron Mountain Research Area, Alan explained, privately owned by the Huron Mountain Club, but designated for scientific research. My university has a long-standing agreement with the club for access. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, covering every aspect of the incident in meticulous detail. By the end, Alan was exhausted, the pain in his arm and leg breaking through the medication. Officer Daniels seemed to notice his fatigue. Just one more question, Dr. Winters, and then we'll let you rest. Is there anything else about the bear or the attack that you think might be relevant? Anything unusual or unexpected? Alan thought for a moment. Not really. The bear behaved as black bears typically do when they feel threatened. If anything, I'm the one who made the mistake. I should have been more cautious after seeing the signs of bear activity, maybe even chosen a different location for the new research plot. Officer Daniels stood up. Don't be too hard on yourself, Doctor. These things happen even to experienced outdoorsmen. We'll continue our investigation and keep you updated. If you remember anything else, please don't hesitate to contact me. He handed Alan a business card, which Alan accepted with his uninjured right hand. After the officials left, Alan closed his eyes, overwhelming fatigue washing over him. The questioning had forced him to relive the attack in vivid detail, bringing back the terror and pain he'd experienced. His body ached, and his mind churned with conflicting emotions. Relief at his survival, fear at how close he'd come to death, guilt at the thought of the bear being euthanized, and uncertainty about the future of his research and his career. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew there was yet another knock at the door. Before he could respond, the door opened and his ex-wife Sarah entered, followed by their daughter Emma. Sarah looked much as she always did, practical and put together, her brown hair cut in a shoulder-length bob, minimal makeup, dressed in slacks and a button-up shirt. At 41, she still had the athletic build of the college swimmer she had once been. Emma, at 16, was a younger version of her mother, though she had Alan's hazel eyes and something of his introspective demeanor. "Alan," Sarah said, her voice a mixture of concern and relief as she approached the bed. "My God, when the hospital called." "I'm okay," he said automatically, though it was patently untrue given his current state. "Really, it looks worse than it is." Emma hung back slightly, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of her father in the hospital bed, his arm in a cast, various monitors attached to him, bandages visible where his hospital gown didn't cover. "Emma," Alan said softly, holding out his good hand to her. "It's okay. Come here." She approached cautiously and took his hand. "Dad, what happened? They just said you were attacked by a bear." Alan gave her a gentle squeeze. "That's the short version, yes. I was doing fieldwork and surprised a black bear. It's very rare for them to attack people, but this one felt threatened and, well, I got the worst of it." Sarah had moved to the other side of the bed and was examining the monitors with the practiced eye of someone familiar with medical settings. She had been a physical therapist before recently returning to school for a nursing degree. "Jessica said you had surgery?" she asked. Alan nodded. "Compound fracture in the left forearm. The bear's teeth, they did some damage, and I have some pretty deep cuts on my leg from its claws." Emma's face had gone pale. "Does it hurt a lot?" "Not right now," Alan assured her, though it wasn't entirely true. "They're keeping me pretty well medicated." Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down. "The doctor we spoke to, Dr. Levine, she said you're going to need significant recovery time, physical therapy, possibly additional surgeries depending on how the bones heal." "That's what they tell me," Alan agreed. Emma had found another chair and sat down, still holding her father's hand. "What about your research? Your students?" "They'll continue the work," Alan said. "Jessica knows the protocols, and I can still supervise remotely, review the data, write up results. It's not ideal, but we'll manage." There was an awkward silence. Despite 3 years of being divorced, there was still a certain tension whenever Alan and Sarah were together. Their marriage had ended not with dramatic conflict, but with the slow erosion of connection as their careers and interests diverged. Sarah had wanted to move back to southeastern Michigan to be closer to her aging parents. Alan couldn't imagine leaving his research in the UP. The physical distance had only highlighted the emotional distance that had been growing between them for years. "The nurse said you can be discharged in about a week," Sarah finally said. "Have you thought about your recovery plan? Where you'll stay?" Alan hadn't thought that far ahead. His apartment in Marquette was a third-floor walk-up, manageable for a healthy person, but potentially problematic for someone with limited mobility. "I haven't had much time to think about it," he admitted. Sarah exchanged a glance with Emma before continuing. "We've discussed it. and we think you should come stay with us in Ann Arbor while you recover, at least for the first few weeks. The house has a guest room on the main floor, no stairs to navigate, and with my nursing training, I can help monitor your recovery." The offer took Alan by surprise. "Sarah, that's very generous, but what about your classes and Emma's school? I don't want to disrupt your lives." "It's summer," Emma pointed out. "School's out for another month, and Mom's program doesn't start back up until September. And it would be good for Emma to have some time with you," Sarah added. "She was planning to come stay with you for a couple of weeks in August anyway." Alan looked at his daughter, who nodded encouragingly. The idea of being in Ann Arbor, away from his research and his university responsibilities, was concerning. But the practicalities were undeniable. He would need help during the initial stages of recovery, and his support network in Marquette consisted mainly of students and colleagues who had their own responsibilities. "I'll think about it," he promised, not ready to commit just yet. "But thank you for the offer." They talked for a while longer, Alan filling them in on more details of the attack and his rescue, though he tempered the account for Emma's benefit, downplaying the most terrifying moments. Sarah, in turn, updated him on her nursing program and Emma's activities with the high school debate team and environmental club. As they chatted, Alan felt a wave of gratitude for this family that, despite the divorce, still functioned as a unit in times of crisis. Sarah might not be his wife anymore, but she was still someone he respected and, in many ways, cared for. And Emma was the center of both their worlds, the one thing they had always been united on. Eventually, Alan's fatigue became apparent, and Sarah stood up. "We should let you rest. We've got a hotel room nearby. We'll come back tomorrow." "I'd like that," Alan said, sincerely. Emma leaned over and carefully hugged him, mindful of his injuries. "I'm glad you're okay, Dad," she whispered. "That bear could have killed you, but it didn't," Alan assured her. "I'm still here, and I'll be fine, I promise." After they left, Alan sank back against the pillows, emotionally and physically drained. The day had been a parade of visitors, each interaction requiring energy he didn't have to spare. But beneath the exhaustion was a growing sense of perspective. The attack had been horrifying, and his injuries were serious, but he was alive. He had a family who cared for him, colleagues who respected him, and work that mattered. As he drifted toward sleep, his mind returned once more to the bear, not with fear this time, but with a naturalist's curiosity. What had happened to the animal after it fled? Was it still in the area, perhaps nursing the wound Alan had inflicted with his small knife? Or had it moved on, wary now of the strange, two-legged creatures that made loud noises and fought back when cornered? In his last moments of consciousness before sleep claimed him, Alan found himself hoping, against all logic and policy, that the bear would evade the DNR's traps and cameras, that it would disappear into the vast forests of the Upper Peninsula, never to encounter humans again. The next few days passed in a monotonous cycle of medical procedures, pain management, and brief periods of consciousness. Alan's injuries, particularly the compound fracture in his arm, proved more challenging than initially expected. On his third day in the hospital, he was taken back to surgery when an infection began to develop in the deep puncture wounds from the bear's teeth. Dr. Levine explained that this was a common complication with animal bites. "Bear mouths are full of bacteria," she told him after the procedure. "We've cleaned out the infection and have you on a strong course of antibiotics, but we'll need to monitor this closely." The infection and second surgery left Alan weaker and more vulnerable than before. His temperature fluctuated, sometimes spiking with fever that left him delirious and disoriented. During these episodes, the line between memory and nightmare blurred. He would find himself back in the forest, feeling the bear's hot breath on his face, hearing its guttural growls, unable to escape. During one particularly bad night, he woke up shouting, convinced that the beeping of the heart monitor was the electronic wail of Jessica's air horn. A startled night nurse rushed in, quickly assessed the situation, and adjusted his medication. After that, a psychiatrist visited briefly, explaining that such reactions were normal after trauma and offering medication for anxiety if needed. Alan declined, preferring to maintain as much mental clarity as possible despite the nightmares. Sarah and Emma visited daily, usually in the afternoons. Sarah helped translate the medical jargon and treatment plans, her nursing training proving invaluable. Emma brought books and magazines, reading to him when his energy was too low for conversation. His research team visited too, though less frequently as they needed to continue the fieldwork. They brought updates on the project, data sheets for Alan to review, and questions about methodology that only he could answer. On the 5th day after the attack, Officer Daniels from the DNR returned. Alan was having one of his better days, sitting up in bed and reviewing data that Jessica had brought him on a tablet. "Dr. Winters," Daniels greeted him. "You're looking better than when I last saw you." "Fighting off an infection," Alan replied, setting aside the tablet. "But I think I'm winning. Any news about the bear?" Officer Daniels pulled up the now familiar visitor's chair. "Actually, yes, that's why I'm here. We've been monitoring the area around your research site with trail cameras and baited traps. Yesterday evening, we captured an adult male black bear about half a mile from where the attack occurred." Alan felt a strange tightness in his chest. "And you think it's the same one?" Daniels nodded. "We're reasonably confident. It matches your description in terms of size. More definitively, it has a fresh wound on its left shoulder, a puncture wound consistent with a small knife." The confirmation that he had managed to wound the bear during the attack brought Alan no satisfaction, only a renewed sense of the desperate struggle he'd been engaged in. "What happens now?" "The bear has been euthanized in accordance with department protocol," Officer Daniels said. His tone was matter-of-fact but not callous. "A necropsy will be performed to check for any health issues that might have contributed to its aggressive behavior, though that's unlikely. Mostly it's for research purposes and to confirm identity through dental impressions that can be matched to your wounds." Alan absorbed this information in silence. As a scientist, he understood the rationale behind the policy. Black bears that attacked humans were statistically likely to do so again, and public safety had to be the priority. But as an ecologist who had dedicated his life to understanding and protecting natural systems, he couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. "We also found your bear spray," Daniels continued. "It was about 10 feet from where you were attacked, still in its holster. Looks like it got knocked off during the initial contact." He handed Alan a plastic evidence bag containing the canister of bear spray. The safety clip was still in place, the canister unused. Alan took it with his good hand, a tangible reminder of how quickly things had gone wrong. He'd never had a chance to deploy the spray, which might have prevented the worst of the attack. "This isn't your fault, Dr. Winters," Officer Daniels said, seeming to read his thoughts. "I've investigated dozens of wildlife encounters over the years. Sometimes, despite every precaution, things just go sideways. You had the spray, you tried to back away, you did everything by the book." Alan appreciated the sentiment, though it did little to alleviate his complicated feelings about the situation. "Thank you for letting me know. Will there be an official report?" Daniels nodded. "I'll file it by the end of the week. You'll be able to request a copy through the DNR office if you need it for insurance purposes or university documentation." He stood up. "I should let you rest unless you have any other questions." Alan shook his head and Officer Daniels departed with a final word of encouragement. Left alone, Alan turned the bear spray canister over in his hand, examining it as if it might provide some insight or closure. Eventually, he set it on his bedside table and picked up the tablet again, trying to refocus on his research data. But his concentration was broken. The news about the bear, its capture, the confirmation of its identity through the wound he'd inflicted, its euthanasia, had stirred up the memories of the attack again. Not the panicked fever dream version that haunted his nights, but the clear, cold reality of what had happened. Two living creatures, each following their own nature, had encountered each other with catastrophic results for both. That evening, after Sarah and Emma had left for their hotel, Alan had another visitor, less expected this time. A woman in her early 30s with a notebook and a press badge introduced herself as Karen Mitchell from the Marquette Mining Journal. "Dr. Winters, I'm sorry to intrude, but we've been hoping to get a statement from you about the bear attack. It's generated quite a bit of local interest." Alan had been dozing and was groggy from pain medication, but he gestured for her to sit down. Jessica had mentioned that the local paper was interested in the story, and he'd said he would provide a statement rather than have rumors circulate. "What would you like to know?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The reporter took a seat, notebook ready. "Could you tell me what happened in your own words? How did you end up face-to-face with a bear? And how did you survive the encounter?" Alan gave her a condensed version of events, sticking to the facts and avoiding both dramatization and technical details that might not interest a general audience. He explained his research, the signs of bear activity he'd noticed, his attempt to back away, the unfortunate fall, and the attack itself. He emphasized Jessica's role in his rescue and the rapid response of emergency services. "The DNR informed me today that they've captured and euthanized the bear," he concluded. "It had a wound on its shoulder from my field knife, confirming it was the same animal." Karen had been taking notes throughout. occasionally looking up with expressions of sympathy or concern. "How do you feel about the bear being euthanized?" she asked. It was a more pointed question than Alan had expected, but he appreciated its directness. "I have mixed feelings," he answered honestly. "As a scientist who studies ecosystems, I value all components of the natural world, including predators like bears, but I understand the policy reasons for euthanizing an animal that has attacked a human. The bear was following its instincts when it perceived me as a threat. Unfortunately, those same instincts make it a public safety risk." The reporter nodded, seeming satisfied with his nuanced response. "Your injuries appear to be quite serious," she observed. "What's your prognosis, and how will this affect your research?" Alan glanced at his casted arm. "I have a compound fracture of the left forearm and deep lacerations on my right thigh, among other injuries. I've had 2 surgeries so far and am fighting an infection from the bite wounds. Recovery will take months, including physical therapy, to regain full function." Shifted slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "As for my research, it will continue. I have a capable team who are following the protocols we established. I can review data remotely and continue the analytical aspects of the work. Field activities will be modified to emphasize safety, including a strict requirement for researchers to work in pairs." "Do you think you'll ever go back to that particular research site?" Karen asked. The question gave Alan pause. He hadn't considered it directly before. Would he be able to return to the exact location where the attack had occurred? The idea sent a chill through him, but he was also reluctant to let fear dictate his professional choices. "Yes," he said finally, "eventually, but with additional precautions and probably not alone. The site has scientific value because of its particular ecological characteristics. It would be irrational to abandon that data collection point because of what happened." Karen seemed impressed by his resolve. "One final question, Dr. Winters. Has this experience changed how you view your work or your relationship with the natural world?" It was the most insightful question she'd asked, cutting to the heart of what Alan had been grappling with since the attack. "It's complicated," he admitted. "I've always approached my work with a deep respect for nature, including its dangers. This experience hasn't diminished that respect. If anything, it's deepened it." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "The natural world isn't benign or malevolent. It simply is. The bear wasn't being cruel when it attacked me. It was responding to a perceived threat according to its evolutionary programming. As humans, we sometimes forget that we're part of that natural world, subject to its processes and dangers, not separate from them or immune to them." He looked out the window at the fading evening light. "So yes, this has changed me. I'll be more cautious in my fieldwork. But it hasn't changed my commitment to understanding and protecting these ecosystems. If anything, having such a visceral reminder of my place within the natural order gives me a perspective that might actually enhance my research." Karen finished writing and closed her notebook. "Thank you, Dr. Winters. That's very thoughtful. We'll run the story in tomorrow's edition. Would it be all right if a photographer came by tomorrow to take a picture to accompany the article?" Alan agreed, though he wasn't particularly looking forward to having his injured state documented for public consumption. After the reporter left, he felt drained. The conversation had forced him to articulate feelings he was still processing, to find a coherent narrative for an experience that had been chaotic and terrifying in the moment. That night, for the first time since the attack, Alan slept without nightmares. Perhaps it was the emotional exhaustion from the day's visitors, or maybe it was having received closure about the bear's fate. Whatever the reason, he slept deeply and woke the next morning feeling marginally stronger, more present in his body. Despite the persistent pain of his injuries, Dr. Levine visited early, checking his vitals and examining the surgical sites. "The infection seems to be responding to the antibiotics," she informed him. "Your white blood cell count is down, and the wound looks less inflamed. If this continues, we could be looking at discharge in 3 days rather than 5. Alan was encouraged by the news. As necessary as hospitalization was, he was growing increasingly restless. The constant monitoring, the institutional food, the limited mobility, it all chafed against his independent nature. "Have you given more thought to your post-discharge plan?" Dr. Levine asked. "You're going to need assistance for at least a few weeks. Daily wound care, help with basic activities of living, transportation to follow-up appointments. My ex-wife has offered to have me stay with her and our daughter in Ann Arbor while I recover," Alan said. "She's training to be a nurse, so she'd be able to help with wound care." Dr. Levine nodded approvingly. "That sounds like an excellent arrangement. I'll make sure your records are transferred to a physician in Ann Arbor for follow-up care. She made a note in his chart. I should warn you, though, the journey itself will be challenging. It's a long drive from Marquette to Ann Arbor, and you'll need to be careful about positioning to avoid putting stress on your injuries. The reminder of the practical challenges ahead was sobering. Alan had been so focused on the immediate medical crisis that he hadn't fully considered the logistics of recovery. The drive to Ann Arbor was nearly 8 hours under the best conditions. In his current state, it would be exhausting and painful. Later that morning, as promised, a photographer from the Marquette Mining Journal arrived to take pictures for the article. Alan submitted to the process with as much dignity as he could muster, though he felt uncomfortably vulnerable, posed in his hospital bed with his injuries visible. The photographer was professional and quick, at least, taking a series of shots and then departing with a word of thanks. Sarah and Emma arrived shortly after, bringing a small potted plant to join the fern Jessica had brought earlier, gradually transforming the sterile hospital room into something marginally more personal. Dr. Levine says I might be discharged in 3 days, Alan told them. And I've been thinking about your offer. If it's still open, I think staying with you in Ann Arbor while I recover makes the most sense. Sarah looked pleased. Of course it's still open. We've already started preparing the guest room. I'm going to help take care of you, Emma added earnestly. Mum's been teaching me how to change bandages. Alan smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. Let's hope my wounds will be a bit less dramatic by the time we get to that stage. But I appreciated him. Really. They discussed the logistics of the journey to Ann Arbor, whether Alan would be cleared to travel by car so soon after his surgeries, what accommodations would need to be made for his comfort during the long drive, what medical supplies they'd need to bring. I'll speak with Dr. Levine about the travel plans, Sarah said. As a medical professional, she might have specific recommendations for managing your injuries during the trip. As they talked, Alan found himself increasingly comfortable with the idea of staying with Sarah and Emma during his recovery. Despite the awkwardness that sometimes still existed between him and his ex-wife, there was also a foundation of mutual respect and shared history, and the chance to spend extended time with Emma was a silver lining to this otherwise unfortunate situation. The next day's edition of the Marquette Mining Journal featured Alan's story on the front page. Jessica brought a copy when she visited, and they read it together. The article was surprisingly thoughtful, avoiding sensationalism in favor of a nuanced discussion of human-wildlife interactions. Karen had quoted Alan extensively, capturing his mixed feelings about the bear's euthanasia and his reflections on humanity's place in the natural world. The accompanying photograph showed Alan in his hospital bed, his left arm in a cast, bandages visible on his right thigh where the hospital gown was draped. His face was pale but composed, his expression serious but not grim. It was, Alan thought, a fair representation of his current state, wounded but resolute. They did a good job, Jessica commented after reading the article. It's not just man versus wild stuff. There's actual substance about the research and the ecology. Alan nodded. Karen seemed genuinely interested in the bigger picture, not just the attack itself. He folded the newspaper and set it aside. How are things going with the research? Any issues with the sampling protocol? Jessica updated him on the team's progress. They had collected samples from all the original research plots and were analyzing them according to the established protocols. They were avoiding the site of the attack for now, respecting both the DNR's ongoing investigation and their own emotional response to what had happened there. Marcus did some preliminary analysis of the soil microbiome data from the last collection, Jessica reported. He thinks he's seeing a pattern in the fungal communities related to soil temperature. I told him to write up his observations and we'd review them together before sending them to you. Alan felt a mixture of pride and frustration. Pride in his team's ability to continue the work in his absence. Frustration at not being able to participate directly. That's good. The temperature-fungi relationship is one of the key components of our climate change resilience model. If Marcus is seeing patterns already, that's promising. They discussed the research for nearly an hour, Alan offering guidance on analytical approaches and suggesting additional variables to consider. The conversation was a welcome distraction from his injuries and a reminder that his professional life would continue despite this setback. After Jessica left, promising to return before his discharge with updates from the team, Alan found himself alone with his thoughts again. The newspaper article had brought a sense of public closure to the incident. The story was out there now, accurate and thoughtful rather than sensationalized. The bear had been found and euthanized according to protocol. His medical condition was improving, his recovery plan was taking shape, yet something still felt unresolved, a lingering disquiet that Alan couldn't quite name. He picked up the newspaper again and reread the final paragraphs. The attack on Dr. Winters has been classified as a defensive response by the bear to a perceived threat, according to DNR officials. It serves as a reminder of the wild nature of Michigan's Upper Peninsula and the importance of proper safety precautions for those who venture into bear country. For Winters, the experience has deepened rather than diminished his respect for the natural world. This hasn't changed my commitment to understanding and protecting these ecosystems, he told the Mining Journal. If anything, having such a visceral reminder of my place within the natural order gives me a perspective that might actually enhance my research. The black bear population in Michigan's Upper Peninsula is estimated at between 8,000 and 10,000 individuals. Attacks on humans remain extremely rare, with this being only the third reported in the state in the past decade. The article presented the attack as an unfortunate but ultimately understandable event, a random intersection of human and wild animal that happened to turn violent. But sitting in his hospital bed, still processing the trauma, both physical and psychological, Alan wondered if there was more to it. Had he missed warning signs that might have prevented the encounter? Could he have responded differently when the bear first appeared? Was there something about that particular bear, a previous history with humans perhaps, or a territorial imperative specific to that location that had made the attack more likely? These questions nagged at him, not out of a desire to assign blame, but from the scientist's instinct to understand, to find patterns, to learn from experience. Yet he knew that some of these questions might never be fully answered. The bear was dead, the moment of the attack was past, and the full complexity of factors that led to their violent intersection could never be completely untangled. Perhaps, Alan reflected, that was part of what made the natural world both so fascinating and so humbling. Despite all our scientific tools and knowledge, there remained an element of the unpredictable, the uncontrollable. Nature operated according to its own principles, indifferent to human desires for safety or understanding. This thought was still with him 3 days later when Dr. Levine officially approved his discharge from the hospital. His condition had stabilized, the infection was under control, and his wounds were healing as expected. He would need follow-up care, ongoing antibiotics, and eventually physical therapy, but these could be managed on an outpatient basis. The discharge process was a flurry of activity. Final examinations, medication instructions, scheduling of follow-up appointments with specialists in Ann Arbor, paperwork to sign. Sarah handled much of it, her medical training making her an effective advocate and translator of the complex care instructions. Finally, everything was in order. A nurse helped Alan into a wheelchair, hospital policy for all discharges, regardless of the patient's condition, and Sarah wheeled him through the corridors and out the main entrance where Emma waited with their car, a practical sedan with the back seat already arranged with pillows to help position Alan comfortably for the long journey. The transition from hospital to outside world was jarring. After more than a week in the controlled environment of the hospital, the sensory input of the parking lot was overwhelming. Bright sunlight, the sounds of traffic, the smell of exhaust mixed with the pollen-heavy summer air. Alan squinted against the light, feeling oddly vulnerable. With Sarah's help, he stood from the wheelchair and carefully maneuvered into the back seat of the car. Even this simple movement sent spikes of pain through his injured thigh and arm. Once settled among the pillows, he leaned back, already exhausted by the effort of the transfer. "Comfortable?" Sarah asked, adjusting a pillow behind his back. "As much as I can be," Alan replied. "Let's get going before the pain meds wear off." Emma slid into the passenger seat while Sarah took the driver's position. They had decided to drive straight through to Ann Arbor, making only necessary stops for restrooms and medication. It would be a long day, but Alan preferred to get the journey over with rather than breaking it into 2 days with an overnight stay somewhere. As they pulled out of the hospital parking lot, Alan looked back at the building where he'd spent the past 11 days. It represented a strange intersection of his life, a place of pain and healing, fear and support, vulnerability and resilience. He was glad to be leaving, yet apprehensive about the road ahead, both literally and figuratively. The drive south from Marquette took them through the heart of the Upper Peninsula, a landscape Alan knew intimately from years of fieldwork. The forests of maple, birch and hemlock that were his research focus gave way gradually to more mixed woodlands as they traveled south. Alan watched the passing scenery with a naturalist's eye, noting the changing vegetation patterns, the occasional wildlife at the forest edges, the geological features visible in road cuts. They crossed the Mackinac Bridge in the late afternoon, leaving the Upper Peninsula behind and entering the Lower Peninsula. The 5-mile span across the Straits of Mackinac, connecting Michigan's two land masses, always felt to Alan like crossing a significant boundary. The Upper Peninsula was wilder, less developed, more closely connected to its natural state. The Lower Peninsula, especially the southern portion where Ann Arbor was located, was more heavily populated and altered by human activity. As they continued south, the landscape became increasingly agricultural, with forests giving way to farmland. Alan dozed intermittently, the motion of the car and his medication combining to lull him in and out of consciousness. When awake, he listened to Emma and Sarah talking quietly in the front seat, or gazed out at the passing countryside, or checked his phone for emails from his research team. They reached Ann Arbor shortly after 9 in the evening, having made the trip in just under 8 hours including stops. Alan was exhausted, his body aching from the prolonged sitting despite the carefully arranged pillows. Sarah navigated through the familiar streets of the college town until they reached her house, a modest 2-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood about 3 miles from the University of Michigan campus. The house looked much as Alan remembered it from his last visit several months ago. Neat landscaping, a well-maintained exterior, a covered front porch with a swing. It was the quintessential American suburban home. Sarah had purchased it after the divorce, using her portion of their property settlement and a mortgage she could afford on her physical therapist's salary. "Home sweet home," Sarah announced as she parked in the driveway. "Alan, let's get you inside and settle before we worry about luggage." With Sarah on one side and Emma on the other, Alan made his slow, painful way from the car to the house and into the guest room that had been prepared for him. It was a small but comfortable space that had once been a home office before Sarah converted it to accommodate occasional visitors. The single bed had been made up with fresh linens, and a bedside table held a lamp, a pitcher of water, and a small arrangement of wildflowers. Emma's touch, no doubt. "Bathroom's right across the hall," Sarah reminded him as she helped him sit on the edge of the bed. "I've put some grab bars in the shower and a seat so you can bathe safely. There's a bell on the nightstand if you need anything during the night. I'll sleep with my door open so I can hear it." Alan was touched by the thoughtfulness of these preparations. "Thank you, Sarah. This is more than I could have asked for." She shrugged, a bit uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just practical considerations. I'd do the same for any patient." But her expression softened slightly. "Try to get some rest. Tomorrow we can establish a proper routine for your care." After helping Alan take his evening medications and ensuring he was comfortably positioned for sleep, Sarah and Emma left him alone, closing the door quietly behind them. Alan lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the house, so different from his apartment in Marquette or the cabin at the field station. Here there were suburban night sounds, distant traffic, the hum of central air conditioning, the occasional voice or television from a neighboring house. Despite his exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. His body ached, the pain medication only partially effective after the strain of the long journey. But beyond the physical discomfort was a deeper sense of displacement. He was far from his normal environment, dependent on others in a way he hadn't been since childhood, separated from his work and colleagues. Alan had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency. As a field researcher, he was accustomed to solving problems independently, making do with available resources, pushing through discomfort to accomplish necessary tasks. Now, something as simple as walking to the bathroom required assistance. It was humbling, and though he was reluctant to admit it even to himself, frightening. Eventually, exhaustion overcame discomfort, and Alan fell into a restless sleep. He dreamed of forests and bears, of running that became an impossible struggle through mud, of falling and being unable to rise. He woke several times during the night, momentarily disoriented before remembering where he was and why. Morning brought a semblance of routine. Sarah helped him to the bathroom and then assisted with changing his bandages, a process that remained painful despite the gentleness of her touch. Emma brought breakfast on a tray, having prepared oatmeal with berries and a cup of strong black coffee, just as Alan preferred it. "I remembered how you like your coffee," she said proudly, "and I thought the oatmeal would be good, easy to eat one-handed." Alan smiled at his daughter's thoughtfulness. "It's perfect, Em. Thank you." As he ate, Sarah outlined the plan for his care. "You have a follow-up appointment with the orthopedic specialist on Thursday. That's 2 days from now. Until then, we focus on rest, proper wound care, and getting you comfortable with moving around a bit more. I've arranged for a home health nurse to visit tomorrow to assess your needs and help set up a physical therapy plan." The next few days fell into a pattern. In the mornings, Sarah would help Alan with his morning medications and bandage changes before leaving for her part-time job at a physical therapy clinic. Emma would bring him breakfast and then sit with him for a while, reading or chatting or helping him check emails from his research team. In the afternoons, Sarah would return and assist with exercises prescribed by the home health nurse to prevent muscle atrophy. Evenings were spent together in the living room, watching television or engaging in quiet conversation. Alan found himself simultaneously grateful for the care and frustrated by his dependence. He tried to contribute where he could, reviewing Emma's summer reading essays, discussing Sarah's nursing coursework, offering input on household decisions, but the limitations of his injuries were inescapable. Simple tasks required assistance, and even short periods of activity left him exhausted. The follow-up appointment with the orthopedic specialist provided a clearer timeline for his recovery. The doctor, a brisk, competent woman named Dr. Chen, examined his arm and reviewed the surgical reports from Marquette. "The fracture is healing well," she informed him after examining the x-rays. "But you're looking at a minimum of 6 more weeks in the cast. After that, we'll reassess and likely transition to a removable brace for another 4 to 6 weeks, along with physical therapy to restore function." "And my leg?" Alan asked. Dr. Chen examined the healing claw marks on his thigh. "The lacerations are closing nicely. No signs of infection. You'll have significant scarring, I'm afraid, but function should return to normal with proper rehabilitation. I'd estimate another 2 weeks of wound care. Then we can focus on rebuilding strength and mobility." It was largely what Alan had expected, but having the timeline confirmed made it more real. He would be dealing with the physical consequences of the bear attack for months to come. His summer research season was effectively over. The fall semester would begin before he was fully recovered, raising questions about his teaching obligations. "When can I return to work?" he asked. "Not field work, but my university responsibilities." Dr. Chen considered the question. "Limited. Work from home could begin soon, assuming you feel up to it mentally. Remote teaching might be possible in 4-6 weeks, depending on your recovery. Full return to campus activities, including standing to lecture for extended periods. I wouldn't recommend that until at least 12 weeks post-injury." The doctor's prognosis was sobering, but also clarifying. Alan needed to adjust his expectations, to accept that recovery would be a long-term process rather than a quick return to normalcy. He would need to communicate with his department chair about modified duties for the fall semester, perhaps switching to online teaching or research-only responsibilities temporarily. That evening, after returning from the appointment, Alan called his department chair at Northern Michigan University. Professor Margaret Wilson had been his colleague for over a decade and had sent several supportive messages during his hospitalization. "Alan, it's good to hear your voice," Margaret said when she answered. "How are you doing?" "Improving slowly," Alan replied. "I'm staying with my ex-wife and daughter in Ann Arbor while I recover. Just had my first follow-up appointment with the specialist here." And the prognosis. Alan summarized what Dr. Chen had told him about the timeline for his recovery, which brings me to the reason for my call. I need to discuss my fall teaching load. Margaret's tone became more businesslike. "I figured as much. What are you thinking?" "The doctor says I could potentially handle remote teaching in 4-6 weeks, but campus activities are out of the question for at least 12 weeks post-injury. That puts us well into the fall semester." There was a pause as Margaret considered this. "Your graduate seminar on forest ecosystem dynamics could probably be converted to an online format without too much difficulty. The undergraduate Intro to Ecology course is more problematic, the lab sections in particular." "Could Marcus take the labs?" Alan suggested, thinking of his most advanced PhD student. "He's taught the course before and he knows the protocols better than anyone." "That might work," Margaret agreed. "Let me look at the schedule and see what we can arrange. The main thing is your recovery, Alan. The department will manage." After discussing a few more logistical details, they ended the call with Margaret promising to email him a proposed teaching plan within the week. Alan set down his phone, feeling a mixture of relief and concern. The conversation had been necessary and productive, but it had also highlighted how much his professional life would be affected by his injuries. Later that evening, as Alan sat in the living room with Sarah and Emma watching a nature documentary, ironically, one about predators of North America, his phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was from Jessica updating him on the research team's activities. Attached was a photograph of the team at one of the research plots, all giving thumbs up to the camera. The message read, "Site 4 sampling complete. All protocols followed. to the letter. Marcus is analyzing fungal community data. Delia is handling soil chemistry. Everyone sends their best wishes for your recovery. P.S. We're working in pairs as instructed, no exceptions. Alan smiled at the photo and the message, appreciating both the update on the research and the implicit reassurance that his team was taking safety seriously. He showed the email to Emma, who had been curious about his work and his students. "They seem nice," she commented, studying the photo. "Do you miss being out there with them?" Alan considered the question thoughtfully. "I miss the work," he admitted, "the sense of discovery, the connection to the forest, the collaborative problem-solving, but I don't miss the sight of the attack." He paused, realizing it was the first time he'd verbalized this distinction. "Actually, I'm not sure how I'll feel about going back to that specific location, even after I'm physically recovered." Emma looked at him with surprising insight for a 16-year-old. "That's normal, Dad. It's like PTSD or something. You had a traumatic experience there." "Emma's right," Sarah added from her position on the couch. "Trauma affects the brain in specific ways. Places and sensory experiences associated with the traumatic event can trigger powerful emotional responses. It's not weakness, it's neurobiology." Alan nodded, appreciating their understanding. "I know intellectually I know that, but it's still difficult to reconcile with how I've always seen myself as someone who's comfortable in wild places, who understands and accepts the risks of fieldwork." "Maybe it's not about going back to being exactly who you were before," Emma suggested. "Maybe it's about becoming someone new, who incorporates this experience into who they are." Alan looked at his daughter with surprise and pride. "When did you get so wise?" Emma shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I don't know. I've been reading a lot about trauma and recovery for my psychology class, and I've been worried about you." The simple admission touched Alan deeply. "Come here," he said, opening his good arm. Emma moved over to sit beside him and he gave her a one-armed hug. "I'm going to be okay. Different, maybe, but okay." The moment was interrupted by Alan's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Officer Daniels from the DNR. Alan answered, curious about why the conservation officer would be calling nearly 2 weeks after their last contact. "Dr. Winters, sorry to bother you," Daniels began. "I hope your recovery is progressing well." "It is, thank you," Alan replied. "What can I do for you, Officer Daniels?" "I wanted to update you on the necropsy results from the bear," Daniels explained. "It's standard procedure, but in this case, there's something you might find interesting from a scientific perspective." Alan's curiosity was piqued. What did they find? The bear was an adult male, approximately 7 years old, based on tooth wear and bone growth markers, Daniels reported. No signs of disease or significant abnormalities that might explain aggressive behavior. However, the pathologist noted several old injuries, a healed fracture in the right front leg consistent with a trap injury, and scar tissue around the neck area suggestive of having been caught in a snare at some point. "Poaching attempts?" Alan asked, immediately concerned. "Bear poaching occurred occasionally in the UP, though it was relatively rare and heavily penalized when discovered. That's our assumption," Daniels confirmed. "The injuries appear to be from 2 to 3 years ago, based on the healing patterns. The bear apparently escaped both attempts." Alan processed this information. A bear that had previous negative encounters with humans might indeed be more likely to perceive humans as threats and respond aggressively when confronted. It wasn't definitive. Black bears typically remain shy of humans even after negative interactions, but it was a factor that hadn't been considered previously. "Is there anything else that might be relevant to understanding the attack?" Alan asked. There was a pause before Daniels responded. "Just one other thing. The bear's stomach contents included berries, plants, and some small mammal remains, normal diet for this time of year, but they also found traces of human food garbage, specifically remnants of energy bar wrappers and what appears to be freeze-dried camping food packaging. This was concerning. Bears that associated humans with food often lost their natural wariness and could become problematic, approaching campsites or research stations in search of easy meals. However, Alan was confident this couldn't be traced to his research team. "That wasn't from us," he stated firmly. "We're meticulous about waste management at our sites. All food waste and packaging is sealed and packed out." "I believe you," Daniels assured him. "This is a popular area for backcountry camping, despite being private land. We suspect a recreational user may have been careless with their trash. There's no way to know for certain." After a few more minutes of conversation, including additional details about the necropsy findings, they ended the call. Alan sat quietly, processing this new information. The bear that had attacked him wasn't just a random animal acting on instinct in the moment. It had a history, previous traumatic encounters with humans, possible conditioning to associate humans with food sources. It didn't excuse the attack or change the outcome, but it added context, a deeper understanding of the complex factors that had led to their fatal encounter. "What was that about?" Sarah asked, having paused the documentary when his call came in. Alan explained the conversation, including the findings about the bear's previous injuries and the human food garbage in its stomach. "It doesn't change anything really," he concluded. "But as a scientist, I appreciate having more data, more context for understanding what happened." "Does it make you feel differently about the bear being euthanized?" Emma asked perceptively. Alan considered the question. "In some ways, yes. A bear that's had multiple negative interactions with humans and has begun associating people with food sources is a legitimate safety concern. The euthanasia decision follows established wildlife management principles in such cases." He paused. "But it also highlights the role of human behavior in creating these situations. If the bear hadn't been previously trapped or snared, if someone hadn't been careless with their food waste, maybe the outcome would have been different." The conversation turned to broader issues of human-wildlife conflict, a topic that engaged both Alan's professional interest and Emma's environmental concerns. Sarah contributed perspectives from her rural upbringing in northern Michigan, where interactions with wildlife were a regular part of life. It was a thoughtful, nuanced discussion that went well beyond the specific incident of Alan's attack, touching on questions of conservation ethics, land use, and the challenges of maintaining wild spaces in an increasingly developed world. Later, lying in bed and reflecting on the day, Alan found himself more at peace than he had been since the attack. The new information about the bear provided a framework for understanding the encounter that felt more complete, more scientifically sound. It didn't erase the trauma or accelerate his physical healing, but it offered a kind of intellectual closure that he hadn't realized he needed. The next few weeks settled into a routine of recovery. Alan's wounds healed steadily, the angry red of fresh injuries gradually fading to pink. The pain diminished, though it never disappeared entirely. He progressed from needing assistance for basic tasks to managing most of his personal care independently, though his casted arm remained a significant limitation. Physical therapy began 3 weeks after his arrival in Ann Arbor. Twice-weekly sessions with a therapist named Michael focused initially on maintaining mobility in his injured leg and preventing muscle atrophy. As the wounds healed further, the exercises became more challenging, aimed at rebuilding strength and function. "You're making good progress," Michael observed during one session, watching Alan complete a series of leg lifts. "Your background in field research is probably helping. You had good baseline fitness before the injury." Alan nodded, concentrating on the exercise. Years of hiking through forests carrying equipment builds endurance, if nothing else. "The goal is to get you back to that level," Michael said, "but it's going to take time and consistent work. Recovery isn't linear. You'll have good days and setbacks." It was a reminder Alan needed periodically. Despite his scientific understanding of the healing process, he sometimes found himself frustrated by the slow pace of recovery, the persistent limitations of his injuries. On good days, he could see progress. On bad days, when pain flared or he struggled with a previously manageable task, it was easy to become discouraged. Throughout this period, Alan maintained regular contact with his research team. Weekly video conferences allowed him to provide guidance on data analysis and interpretation. Jessica and Marcus sent detailed updates on field activities, including photographs of research sites and sample processing. Delia, whose strength was in technical writing, drafted sections of a manuscript based on data they'd collected before the attack. The connection to his work provided Alan with intellectual engagement that helped counterbalance the physical challenges of recovery. It also gave him a sense of purpose, a reminder that his professional identity continued despite his current limitations. 6 weeks after the attack, Alan had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Chen that marked a significant milestone in his recovery. The cast on his left arm was removed, revealing pale, atrophied skin and a wasted forearm. The surgical scars were prominent, jagged lines where the bear's teeth had punctured flesh, neater incisions where surgeons had repaired the compound. "Fracture. The bone has healed well," Dr. Chen informed him after examining the new x-rays. "Not perfectly aligned, but within acceptable parameters. You'll have some lasting limitation in range of motion, but with dedicated physical therapy, you should regain most of your functionality." She fitted him with a removable brace, explaining, that he should wear it most of the time for the next 4 weeks, but remove it for bathing and therapy exercises. The freedom from the cast was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating to have movement again, terrifying to feel how weak and unstable the arm had become. That evening, Alan sat on the back porch of Sarah's house, experimentally moving his left hand and wrist for the first time in over a month and a half. The movement was restricted and painful, the muscles weak from disuse. But there was a profound relief in being able to feel the evening air on his skin, to trace the scars with his right hand, to begin reclaiming this part of his body that had been immobilized for so long. Emma joined him, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed one to him and sat in the adjacent chair. "Does it hurt?" she asked, watching him flex his fingers. "Yes," Alan admitted, "but it's a different kind of pain now, more like the burn of unused muscles than the sharp pain of broken bones and torn flesh." Emma nodded, sipping her lemonade. "Mum says that's a good sign. Pain that comes with healing movement is different from pain that warns of damage." Alan smiled at his daughter. "Your mum is right, as usual." He looked down at his arm, at the scars that would forever mark his skin. "These will fade somewhat with time, but they'll always be visible, a permanent reminder. Like a story written on your body," Emma suggested. Alan considered this poetic interpretation. "I suppose it is. Not a story I would have chosen, but one that's now part of who I am." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The Michigan summer was at its peak, warm days giving way to pleasantly cool evenings. In the UP, Alan knew, his research team would be making the most of these long summer days, collecting the final sets of samples before the season began to turn toward fall. "I've been thinking," Emma said eventually. "School starts in 3 weeks. Are you going to stay here in Ann Arbor or go back to Marquette?" It was a question Alan had been considering himself. His recovery had progressed to the point where he could manage most daily activities independently, though he still needed help with some tasks, and continued to attend physical therapy twice weekly. The fall semester would begin at Northern Michigan University around the same time as Emma's high school classes resumed. "I'm not sure yet," he answered honestly. "Physically, I might be able to manage on my own soon, but there are practical considerations. My apartment in Marquette has stairs, which might still be challenging, and my therapy schedule is established here." He paused. "What do you think? Would you and your mom be ready to reclaim the guest room?" Emma shook her head firmly. "No, Mom and I have already talked about it. You can stay as long as you need to, actually." She hesitated. "I kind of like having you here. It's been nice even though the circumstances are awful." Alan was touched by her candor. Since the divorce, his relationship with Emma had been maintained through weekend visits, summer stays, and regular phone calls. This extended period of living under the same roof, seeing each other daily, had changed the dynamic of their relationship in subtle but meaningful ways. "I've enjoyed it too," he told her. "Not the bear attack part, obviously, but being here with you, watching you in your daily life instead of just hearing about it afterward. Seeing the amazing young woman you're becoming." Emma blushed, embarrassed but pleased by the praise. "So maybe stay until you're cleared to drive. That would be another month or so, right?" Alan nodded. "That sounds like a reasonable plan, assuming your mom agrees. I'll need to go back to Marquette eventually. My work is there, my life is there, but there's no rush." The conversation drifted to other topics: Emma's upcoming debate team tryouts, a new ecological journal article Alan had been asked to review, a movie they were planning to watch that weekend. It was ordinary family conversation, the kind that had once been a regular part of Alan's life before the divorce, and that he now realized he had deeply missed. Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Alan discussed the question of his return to Marquette with Sarah. They sat at the kitchen table, each with a cup of tea, the house quiet around them. "Emma mentioned you've talked about me staying longer," Alan began. "I don't want to impose, but practically speaking, it might make sense for me to continue my recovery here until I'm cleared to drive. That would be another month, approximately." Sarah nodded. "That's what I was thinking too. Your follow-up. Care is established here. You're making good progress with physical therapy, and frankly, I'm not convinced you're ready to manage completely on your own yet." She smiled slightly. "Besides, Emma has enjoyed having you here. So have I, surprisingly enough." The admission seemed to catch her off guard, as if she hadn't intended to say it aloud. Alan raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment directly. Then, "It's settled. I'll stay until I'm cleared to drive, then reassess. I'll need to make arrangements with the university for remote teaching in the meantime." Sarah sipped her tea, seemingly relieved that he hadn't pursued her unintended disclosure. "Have you thought about what you'll do when you go back? Will You returned to the same research site. It was a question Alan had been avoiding. I don't know, he admitted. Logically, scientifically, there's no reason not to. The bear is gone. The data from that site is valuable for the continuity of my research, but emotionally, he trailed off, struggling to articulate the complex feelings the thought of returning evoked. It's okay if you're not ready to make that decision yet, Sarah said gently. Trauma takes time to process, and there's nothing wrong with choosing a different site if that one holds too many difficult memories. Alan appreciated her understanding. This was one of the things that had made their marriage work for many years. Sarah's ability to offer perspective without judgment, to acknowledge the emotional aspects of situations that Alan sometimes tried to approach too rationally. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. The care, the place to stay, the support. I don't know what I would have done without you and Emma these past weeks. Sarah shrugged, a bit uncomfortable with the gratitude as always. You'd have managed. You're nothing if not resourceful. She stood and carried her empty teacup to the sink. But I'm glad we could be here for you. Despite everything, we're still family in some way. The words hung in the air between them, acknowledging a connection that had endured beyond the end of their marriage. Alan nodded, not trusting himself to speak without revealing more emotion than he was prepared to show. The next month passed quickly, filled with physical therapy sessions, remote teaching preparations, and increasingly independent activities as Alan's strength returned. By the time he was cleared to drive in late September, the Michigan summer had given way to early fall, with cooler temperatures and the first hints of color in the changing leaves. The decision to return to Marquette was both straightforward and complicated. Professionally, Alan needed to be there. His research team was transitioning from field collection to laboratory analysis phase, requiring his direct supervision. The department had accommodated his remote teaching for the start of the semester, but expected him to resume in-person classes by October if medically cleared. His life, his apartment, his colleagues, his work was in Marquette. Emotionally, however, the prospect of leaving Ann Arbor brought unexpected feelings of loss. The time with Emma had been precious, allowing him to participate in her daily life in a way that weekend visits never permitted, and his relationship with Sarah had evolved during his stay, moving beyond the sometimes awkward post-divorce cordiality to a more genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared concern for their daughter. On the morning of his departure, Alan packed his modest belongings into his car, which Sarah and Emma had arranged to have driven down from Marquette weeks earlier. His medical supplies, clothing, and personal items fit easily into the trunk, a small representation of the temporary life he had built during his recovery. Emma hugged him tightly before he got into the car. "Promise you'll call more often," she insisted, "and maybe I can come up for a weekend soon. We could go to that diner you like, the one with the good pancakes." "Absolutely," Alan agreed, returning the hug with both arms, a simple action that had been impossible for weeks after the attack. "And you'll come for your usual winter break visit too, right? We can go snowshoeing if you want. As long as we don't run into any bears," Emma joked, then immediately looked worried. "Sorry, that was stupid." Alan smiled reassuringly. "It's okay. Actually, it's good to be able to joke about it, and winter is hibernation season anyway. No bears to worry about." Sarah's goodbye was more reserved, but no less sincere. "Drive safely," she instructed. "Stop if you get tired or sore, and call when you arrive so we know you made it." "Yes, ma'am," Alan replied with a mock salute, earning a smile from his ex-wife. "And Sarah, thank you for everything, I mean it." She nodded, accepting the gratitude this time without deflection. "You're welcome. Take care of yourself, Alan." The drive back to Marquette was long but uneventful. Alan stopped more frequently than he normally would, stretching his still healing body and being careful not to overtax his recovering arm. The early fall scenery was beautiful, with splashes of red and gold beginning to appear among the predominantly green forests. As he drove north, the development of southern Michigan gave way to the more sparsely populated central regions and finally to the wild beauty of the Upper Peninsula. Crossing the Mackinac Bridge in the opposite direction felt symbolic, a return to his regular life after the interlude of recovery in Ann Arbor. The familiar landscape of the UP welcomed him with its rugged terrain and vast forests. After months away, Alan felt a sense of homecoming as he drove the final stretch toward Marquette. His apartment, when he finally reached it, was clean and aired out, the work of Jessica and Marcus, who had been checking on it periodically during his absence. They had even stocked the refrigerator with basics, and left a pot of beef stew on the stove with a note. "Welcome home, Professor. Heat and eat when you arrive. First department meeting is tomorrow at 10 a.m. Don't worry, we've got your back. J&M." The thoughtfulness of his students brought a lump to Alan's throat. Throughout his recovery, they had stepped up not just professionally but personally, demonstrating a care that went beyond the typical student-professor relationship. After eating the stew and unpacking his essentials, Alan stood at the window of his third-floor apartment, looking out over Lake Superior. The great inland sea stretched to the horizon, its surface rippled by a light wind. The familiar view grounded him, connecting him to the place that had been his home for the past 15 years. Tomorrow would bring the return to professional responsibilities, department meetings, student advising, lecture preparations. Soon, he would need to make decisions about his research activities, including whether to return to the site of the attack. For now, though, he simply stood at the window, watching the play of early evening light on the water, feeling the complex mix of emotions that came with returning to normal life after a life-altering event. The university campus buzzed with fall semester activity when Alan arrived for the department meeting the next morning. Students hurried between buildings, faculty gathered in small groups for impromptu discussions, maintenance staff prepared the grounds for the coming winter. It was a familiar scene that now felt slightly surreal, as if Alan were watching it through a filter of his recent experience. The Ecology and Environmental Science Department was housed in a modern building on the north side of campus. Alan made his way to the conference room, conscious of walking more slowly than he once had, his gait still slightly affected by the healing injuries to his right thigh. He arrived early, wanting a moment to compose himself before facing his colleagues as a group for the first time since the attack. The room was empty except for Margaret Wilson, the department chair, who was arranging papers at the head of the table. She looked up when Alan entered and broke into a warm smile. "Alan, welcome back." She approached him with arms outstretched, then hesitated. "Can I hug you, or would that be uncomfortable with your injuries?" "A gentle hug is fine," Alan assured, her accepting the careful embrace. "I'm much improved, still doing physical therapy, but making good progress." Margaret stepped back, studying him with a critical eye. "You look better than I expected, to be honest. When we spoke on the phone, you sounded pretty rough." "That was weeks ago," Alan reminded her. "The human body is remarkably resilient, it turns out." They chatted for a few minutes about his recovery and the arrangements for his gradual return to full teaching duties. Alan would resume his graduate seminar in person immediately, but continue the larger undergraduate course online for another 2 weeks before transitioning back to the lecture hall. As they talked, other faculty members began to arrive. Each greeted Alan with varying degrees of concern and curiosity. Some asked detailed questions about his injuries and recovery. Others clearly wanted to know about the attack itself, but were too polite to ask directly. Alan answered patiently, having prepared himself for this attention. The story of his bear encounter had become something of a legend on campus during his absence, no doubt enhanced in the retelling. The meeting itself was standard departmental business: budget updates, curriculum discussions, research grant, announcements. Alan participated when relevant but otherwise sat quietly, reacclimatizing to the rhythms of academic administration. It felt simultaneously familiar and strange, like returning to a place you once knew intimately but now see through. Changed eyes. After the meeting, Alan headed to his office. The small room on the second floor of the science building had been untouched during his absence, preserved exactly as he had left it on the morning of the attack. Books and journals lined the shelves. A half-written grant proposal sat on the desk. Student papers waited in a folder for grading that had never happened. It was as if time had stood still in this one space, while Alan's life had been dramatically altered. He was arranging his desk and checking emails when there was a knock at the open door. Looking up, he saw Jessica, Marcus, and Delia standing. In the doorway, expressions a mixture of delight and uncertainty. "Professor Winters," Jessica exclaimed, "you're really back." Alan stood, genuinely pleased to see them. "I'm really back. Come in, all of you." They entered the office, and for a moment, there was an awkward silence, everyone conscious of the last time they had been together, in the hospital after the attack. Then, Marcus broke the tension in his characteristic fashion. "So I hear Arbor has some decent craft breweries, but nothing like the Ordok here. Tell me you at least found good beer during your exile." It was such a typical Marcus comment, focusing on the trivial to diffuse a heavy moment, that everyone laughed. "The beer was adequate," Alan replied with mock seriousness. "The medical care was better." This opened the floodgates, and soon they were all talking at once. updating Alan on the research progress, sharing department gossip he had missed, asking about his recovery. The interaction felt normal in a way that the department meeting hadn't, perhaps because these were the people who had seen him at his most vulnerable and had stepped up to continue his work in his absence. "We've been processing the summer samples," Jessica explained, opening her laptop to show him some preliminary results. "The fungal community analysis is particularly interesting. We're seeing distinct patterns related to soil temperature and moisture gradients, just as you predicted." Alan examined the data with interest. "This is excellent work. Have you run the statistical analysis yet?" Marcus nodded. "Initial ANOVA shows significant differences between sites. I'm working on a more complex multivariate analysis to tease out the specific environmental drivers." They continued discussing the research for nearly an hour, the familiar technical conversation, grounding Alan in his professional identity. These were the questions that had driven his career: how forest soil microbiomes responded to environmental conditions, what that might tell us about ecosystem resilience in the face of climate change, how the intricate relationships between organisms above and below the ground maintained the health of northern forests. Eventually, the conversation turned to the next steps for the research project. "We've continued sampling at all the established sites except the new one." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Roberts family campsite at Glacier National Park. Susan Roberts stood outside their rented cabin, breathing in the crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. At 42, Susan had finally convinced her husband Michael to take the family vacation she'd been planning for years. Their children, Emma, 10, and Jason, 7, had spent the last 3 days exploring trails, identifying wildlife from the safety of ranger-led tours, and learning about the delicate ecosystem of one of America's most treasured national parks. "Mom, can we have the picnic today?" Emma asked, stepping onto the small wooden porch of their cabin. Her long brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her hiking boots already laced up despite the early hour. Susan smiled, tucking a strand of her own sandy blonde hair behind her ear. "That's the plan. Your dad's just finishing up the sandwiches." Through the cabin window, Susan could see Michael meticulously arranging turkey and cheese sandwiches in their blue cooler. At 45, Michael's hairline had begun its inevitable retreat, but his athletic build remained a testament to his weekend hiking trips back home in Minneapolis. As an environmental engineer, Michael had initially resisted the idea of a tourist trap vacation, but Susan had worn him down with promises of genuine wilderness experiences away from the park's more crowded areas. "Where are we going for the picnic?" Jason appeared beside his sister, his freckled face animated with excitement. Unlike Emma's methodical approach to their vacation, complete with a self-made checklist of animals to spot, Jason moved through the world with unbridled enthusiasm that occasionally veered into recklessness. "Reynolds Creek," Susan replied, checking her watch. "It's about a 40-minute hike from here. Ranger Peterson recommended it yesterday, said it's beautiful but not too crowded." Inside, Michael zipped up the cooler. "Everything's ready. You guys have your water bottles?" The children nodded, patting their small backpacks. "Bear spray?" Michael asked, his voice taking on the slightly more serious tone he used when discussing safety measures. "Right here." Susan patted the canister attached to her belt. Another identical canister was clipped to Michael's belt. They had attended the park's bear safety orientation on their first day, and while the rangers had emphasized that bear attacks were rare, they had also stressed the importance of proper preparation. Glacier National Park was home to both black bears and grizzlies, and though sightings were considered a privilege by wildlife enthusiasts, the Roberts family had agreed that observing bears from a safe distance, preferably through binoculars or from inside their rental car, was adventure enough. The family set out at 9:30, following the trail that led from their cabin cluster toward Reynolds Creek. The day promised perfect picnic weather, warm sunshine tempered by a gentle breeze, with just enough cloud cover to provide occasional relief from the August sun. Emma walked ahead with Michael, her nature guidebook in hand, stopping occasionally to identify wildflowers or search for animal tracks. Susan and Jason followed a few paces behind, with Jason darting off the trail every few minutes to investigate interesting rocks or fallen logs. "Remember to stay where we can see you," Susan called out as Jason ventured toward a large boulder. "And make noise." "Hey bear, no bears here, just us people," Jason shouted, giggling at the ritual they'd practiced since arriving at the park. The rangers had explained that most bear encounters could be avoided by making enough noise to alert bears to human presence, giving the animals time to move away. The trail wound through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, occasionally opening to reveal breathtaking views of distant peaks, still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Susan took photos at these vistas, capturing Emma's wonder-struck expressions and Jason's exuberant poses. Michael, normally preoccupied with work concerns, seemed to relax with each passing mile, pointing out interesting geological formations and recalling facts from the visitor center exhibits. They reached Reynolds Creek shortly before 11. The site was everything Ranger Peterson had promised, a grassy clearing beside the creek, which bubbled melodically over smooth stones. Tall trees provided dappled shade, and wildflowers dotted the edges of the clearing. Most importantly, they had the area to themselves. "This is perfect," Susan declared, dropping her backpack onto a flat area of grass. "Michael, can you help me spread the blanket?" Together, they unfolded the large plaid blanket that had accompanied their family outings since Emma was a toddler. The children helped arrange their picnic setup, placing the cooler at one corner of the blanket and their backpacks at another. "Remember the rules," Michael said as he began unpacking their lunch. "No leaving food unattended, no wandering off alone, and everything gets packed out." The family ate their sandwiches in the dappled sunlight, the conversation flowing easily from observations about their morning hike to plans for the remaining 3 days of their vacation. Susan had meticulously researched activities that would appeal to everyone. A boat tour of Lake McDonald for Michael's interest in glacial geography, a junior ranger program for Jason's boundless energy, and wildlife spotting opportunities for Emma's budding interest in biology. After lunch, the children asked for permission to explore the creek's edge, staying within sight of their parents. Susan and Michael sat on the blanket, watching as Emma carefully turned over rocks in the shallow water, searching for insects and small fish, while Jason attempted to build a miniature dam with pebbles. "I'm glad we came," Michael admitted, leaning back on his elbows. "You were right about this place." Susan smiled, savoring her husband's rare admission of being wrong. "It's good for the kids to see places like this, to understand what we're trying to protect." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes after years of marriage where thoughts can be shared without words. The peace of the moment, children playing safely, the gentle sounds of the creek, the subtle fragrance of wildflowers, felt like a reward for the months of planning, the long drive from Minnesota, and the considerable expense of the trip. At 1:30, with the sun climbing higher in the sky, Susan began packing away the remnants of their lunch. The children had returned to the blanket, Emma to record observations in her nature journal, and Jason to gulp down a juice box. "Can we stay a little longer?" Emma asked, not looking up from her careful sketches of a butterfly she'd spotted near the creek. "Just until 2, Susan replied, checking her watch. "We should head back before it gets too hot." Michael stood, stretching his back. "I'm going to find a tree," he said, the family's code for a bathroom break. "Be right back." He walked toward a dense stand of trees about 50 yards from their picnic spot, carrying a small trowel and biodegradable toilet paper, in accordance with park guidelines for backwoods bathroom use. Susan continued packing, placing their trash in a sealable bag and organizing the reusable containers in the cooler. The bear safety orientation had emphasized the importance of properly securing food and food waste, as Bear's keen sense of smell could detect edibles from remarkable distances. She was just closing the cooler when she heard it, a sound like breaking branches coming from the opposite direction from where Michael had disappeared. Susan glanced up, expecting to see another hiker approaching their secluded spot. Instead, her heart nearly stopped. Approximately 30 yards away, a young grizzly bear had emerged from the trees and was sniffing the air in their direction. Even from a distance, Susan could see the distinctive shoulder hump that identified it as a grizzly rather than a black bear. Its fur was cinnamon brown, catching the sunlight as the bear moved with surprising grace for an animal of its size. Susan's mind raced through the bear safety information they'd received. Make yourself known. Speak calmly. Back away, slowly. Don't run. Have bear spray ready. She swallowed hard, reaching for her bear spray while keeping her eyes on the animal. "Kids," she said, striving to keep her voice steady. "Look over there. There's a bear. I want you to very slowly move behind me." Emma looked up from her journal, her expression changing from annoyance at the interruption to wide-eyed fear as she spotted the grizzly. With remarkable self-control for a 10-year-old, she closed her journal, stood, and moved behind her mother without making any sudden movements. Jason, however, reacted differently. "A bear!" he exclaimed, his voice louder than Susan would have liked. He jumped to his feet, pointing excitedly. The bear's head swung toward them, ears perked forward with interest. It rose slightly on its hind legs, gaining another foot or so of height as it better assessed the humans in its territory. "Jason, behind me now," Susan hissed, her hand closing around the bear spray canister. "Stay very quiet and still." For once, Jason obeyed immediately, scrambling behind his mother. Susan positioned herself between her children and the bear, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the animal could hear it. "Hey, bear!" Susan called out, trying to mimic the calm, assertive tone the ranger had used during their orientation. "We see you. We're just going to move away now." The bear dropped back to all fours, but showed no sign of retreating. Instead, it took a few steps toward them, nose raised to catch their scent. Susan estimated it weighed around 300 pounds, smaller than a fully grown male grizzly, but still more than capable of causing serious harm. "Where's Dad?" Jason whispered, his voice trembling. Susan didn't dare take her eyes off the bear to look for Michael. "He'll be back soon," she reassured her son, though she was praying Michael would stay away until the bear lost interest. One adult facing a grizzly was terrifying enough. She didn't want to imagine what might happen if her husband came running back to the picnic site, potentially triggering the bear's predatory instincts. The bear took another step forward, then another. It was now about 20 yards away and moving with purpose. Susan removed the safety clip from the bear spray, ready to deploy it if necessary, though she knew it would only be effective at much closer range, a last resort she desperately hoped to avoid. "Mom?" Emma's voice was barely audible, tight with fear. "It's okay," Susan lied, her motherly instinct to comfort overriding the terror that threatened to paralyze her. "We're going to move very slowly toward that big tree." She nodded toward a large, ponderosa pine about 15 yards to their right. "Stay behind me." The small family group began their cautious retreat, moving with agonizing slowness. The bear, however, seemed increasingly interested, changing its trajectory to intercept them. It wasn't charging, but its purposeful approach suggested it wasn't, merely curious. Susan's mind raced, trying to recall everything she'd learned about bear behavior. Was this a predatory approach, defensive aggression, simple curiosity? The young grizzly's body language, head slightly lowered, ears forward, offered no clear answers to her untrained eye. They had covered perhaps 5 yards when the bear suddenly increased its pace, moving toward them in a determined trot. Susan felt a primeval fear surge through her body, a biochemical flood of adrenaline and cortisol preparing her for fight or flight. "Run to the tree," she told her children, her voice cracking. "Climb as high as you can, go now." The children bolted, and the bear, perhaps triggered by their sudden movement, charged forward with shocking speed. Susan raised the bear spray, removed the safety, and waited until the animal was within 20 feet before depressing the trigger. The capsaicin spray deployed in a widening cloud that caught the charging grizzly full in the face. The bear reared up, pawing at its eyes and nose, emitting a sound between a roar and a whine that raised the hair on Susan's arms. For a moment, she thought the spray had worked as intended, giving them time to escape. She began backing toward the tree where Emma was already helping Jason onto the lowest branch. But the young grizzly, though clearly distressed by the spray, didn't flee. Instead, it shook its massive head and continued its advance, partially blinded but no less determined. Susan realized with horror that she had missed the opportunity to escape while the bear was momentarily incapacitated. Now it was coming for her, driven by pain and confusion to eliminate the perceived threat. "Climb!" Susan shouted to her children as she turned to run for the tree, but her foot caught on the corner of their picnic blanket, sending her sprawling onto the ground. She rolled onto her back just as the bear reached her. Time seemed to slow as the grizzly loomed above her. Susan raised her arms to protect her face, following the play dead protocol for grizzly attacks that the rangers had described. The bear's breath was hot and fetid as it lowered its head toward her, saliva dripping from jaws powerful enough to crush bone. The first bite came as a shock of pressure rather than pain, the bear's teeth sinking into the flesh of her right thigh. Susan bit back a scream, knowing that additional noise might further agitate the animal. The rational part of her brain, the part that wasn't overwhelmed by terror and pain, registered that she should remain as still as possible, simulating death to remove herself as a threat, but maintaining stillness became impossible as the bear released her leg and clamped its jaws around her left shoulder, the pressure incredible as teeth designed for tearing through hide and flesh met human skin and muscle. This time Susan couldn't suppress her scream, the sound tearing from her throat as primal and raw as the animal attacking her. "Hey! Hey!" Michael's voice carried across the clearing, accompanied by the sound of something hitting trees. He had emerged from the woods and was banging the small metal trowel against tree trunks, creating a cacophony designed to distract the bear. "Get away from her!" The bear released Susan's shoulder, raising its head to locate this new threat. Blood, her blood, matted the fur around its mouth as it assessed Michael, who continued making noise while slowly moving closer. His own bear spray raised. Susan's world had narrowed to islands of agony where the bear's teeth had torn into her body. She could feel warm blood soaking through her hiking pants and shirt, and a distant, clinical part of her mind noted that she was likely going into shock. She heard her children crying from their perch in the tree, their voices seeming to come from much farther away than was physically possible. The bear, momentarily distracted by Michael, turned back to Susan with renewed interest. It lowered its head again, this time toward her face. Susan could smell its wild, musky odor, see the intelligence in its dark eyes, even as her body screamed with pain and terror. Then came another cloud of bear spray, this time from Michael's canister. He had closed the distance enough to deliver a direct hit, and this second dose, combined with the lingering effects of Susan's earlier spray, finally proved too much for the young grizzly. It backed away, shaking its head violently and making distressed vocalizations. Michael continued making noise, alternating between shouting and banging the metal trowel against rocks and trees. The confused and irritated bear made a few false charges, stopping short each time before finally turning and lumbering back into the forest, occasionally stopping to rub its face against the ground or against tree trunks, trying to relieve the burning sensation of the capsaicin. The moment the bear disappeared into the trees, Michael rushed to Susan's side, dropping to his knees beside her. "Oh God, Susan, oh God." His voice broke as he assessed her injuries. The bite to her thigh had torn through her hiking pants, leaving a semicircular pattern of puncture wounds that were bleeding steadily, but not gushing, suggesting no major arteries had been severed. Her shoulder was worse. The bear's powerful jaws had clamped through muscle and possibly damaged the joint. Her shirt was soaked with blood, the fabric torn to reveal mangled flesh. "The kids," Susan managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're safe in the tree," Michael assured her, though he glanced up to confirm. Emma and Jason remained on, their perch about 10 feet off the ground, both crying but physically unharmed. "Emma, Jason, stay up there for now, okay? I need to help Mom." Michael pulled their first aid kit from his backpack, his hands shaking so badly that he struggled to open the zipper. Inside were basic supplies, bandages, gauze, antiseptic wipes, medical tape. Nothing adequate for the severity of Susan's injuries, but enough to begin addressing the bleeding until help arrived. "I need to call for help," he told Susan, his voice steadying as he focused on the immediate tasks. "I'm going to use the satellite phone. Just hold on." The Roberts family had invested in a satellite phone specifically for this trip, acknowledging that many areas of the park had no cell service. Michael retrieved it from his backpack, saying a silent prayer of thanks that they had splurged on this precaution that some of their friends had deemed excessive. With one hand pressing gauze against Susan's shoulder wound, Michael dialed 911 with the other. The connection took agonizing seconds to establish. "1, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was clear but distant. "Bear attack at Glacier National Park, Reynolds Creek area," Michael said, forcing himself to speak, slowly and clearly despite his racing heart. "My wife is badly injured, bites to the leg and shoulder. We need immediate medical assistance." The dispatcher asked a series of questions: exact location, nature of injuries, current situation, whether the bear was still present, while instructing Michael on how to control the bleeding and monitor Susan for signs of shock. Michael answered as best he could, describing their approximate location using trail markers they had passed. "Emergency services are being dispatched," the dispatcher finally said. "Park rangers will be the first to respond, followed by medical evacuation. Keep the victim warm, continue applying pressure to control bleeding, and monitor her breathing and pulse. Do not move her unless absolutely necessary. Stay on the line, if possible." Michael wedged the phone between his ear and shoulder, freeing both hands to tend to Susan's wounds. "Emma," he called up to the tree, "I need you to throw down your jacket, and Jason's too." Emma, displaying remarkable composure for her age, helped her younger brother remove his jacket before taking off her own. She dropped them down to her father, who used them to cover Susan, trying to ward off the shock that was setting in. Susan's face had grown alarmingly pale, her breathing shallow. She kept her eyes fixed on Michael's face, as though his features were an anchor keeping her tethered to consciousness. "The bear," she whispered. "It's gone," Michael assured her, though he frequently scanned the tree line, terrified that the animal might return. "Help is coming. Just stay with me, okay? Stay awake." Time stretched elastically as they waited for rescue, minutes feeling like hours. Michael continued talking to Susan, to the children, to the dispatcher, a continuous stream of reassurance and information that helped keep his own panic at bay. He described their surroundings in detail to help the rescue team locate them, provided updates on Susan's condition, and encouraged the children to remain in the tree until help arrived. Finally, nearly 40 minutes after Michael's call, they heard voices on the trail. "Hello, Park Service, is anyone there?" "Here," Michael shouted, relief flooding through him. "We're here. Bear attack." 2 park rangers emerged into the clearing, rifles ready, scanning the area for signs of the bear before approaching the injured woman. Behind them came 2 more rangers carrying emergency medical equipment. "I'm Ranger Carver," said the first ranger to reach them, a broad-shouldered woman with short grey hair and a weathered face that suggested decades of outdoor service. "This is Ranger Martinez. The other 2 are Ranger Lewis and Ranger Thompson. They're trained EMTs." The EMT rangers immediately knelt beside Susan, gently moving Michael aside to assess her injuries. One began cutting away the fabric around her wounds, while the other took her vital signs. "Blood pressure's low," he reported. "Pulse rapid and thready. Probable hypovolemic shock." Ranger Carver helped the children down from the tree, while Ranger Martinez established a perimeter, remaining vigilant for the bear's return. The EMTs worked efficiently, cleaning and dressing Susan's wounds as best they could in the field, establishing an IV line to begin fluid replacement and administering pain medication. "We've called in a helicopter evacuation," Ranger Lewis told Michael as they prepared Susan for transport. "There's a clearing about a quarter mile from here that can serve as a landing zone. We'll need to move her there on a litter." Michael nodded, watching as they transferred Susan onto a collapsible stretcher. She was still conscious but disoriented, her eyes unfocused, her responses to questions delayed and slurred. "What about the kids?" Michael asked, suddenly realizing the logistical complexities ahead. "Can they come in the helicopter?" Ranger Carver shook her head. "The medical helicopter only has room for the patient and 1 medical attendant. We'll escort you and your children back to the ranger station. From there, we can arrange transportation to the hospital." The gravity of their situation hit Michael anew. His wife would be airlifted to a hospital, while he would have to find his way there with 2 traumatized children, navigating unfamiliar territory in a state of emotional distress. "Which hospital?" he asked, trying to formulate a plan. "Kalispell." "Regional," Ranger Lewis replied as they secured Susan to the stretcher. "It's the closest facility with a Level 3 trauma center, about an hour from the park's west entrance by car." Michael knelt beside the stretcher, taking Susan's hand. Her fingers were cold, her wedding ring standing out starkly against her pallid skin. "I'll meet you at the hospital," he told her, trying to keep his voice steady for her sake and for the children, who stood nearby holding hands and watching with wide, frightened eyes. "The kids are fine. Everything's going to be okay." Susan's eyes found his, a moment of clarity breaking through the haze of shock and medication. "Take care of them," she whispered, the effort of speaking evident in the tightening of her features. "Love you." "Love you too," Michael replied, his throat constricting around the words. He stepped back as the rangers prepared to move her, allowing them space to work while he gathered the children close. The journey to the helicopter landing zone was a nightmare of uneven terrain, with the rangers carrying Susan's stretcher over rocks and roots, trying to minimize jostling while maintaining necessary speed. Michael and the children followed, Emma maintaining remarkable composure, while Jason alternated between tears and shocked silence. The medical helicopter was already waiting when they reached the small clearing, its rotors turning at a low idle that still generated enough wind to flatten the surrounding grass and force them all to duck their heads. A flight paramedic jumped out as they approached, meeting the rangers halfway to help transfer Susan into the aircraft. The transfer happened with practiced efficiency, the paramedic quickly checking the rangers' field treatment before securing Susan inside the helicopter. There was no time for goodbyes. Within minutes, the rotors increased their speed, the sound becoming a deafening roar as the helicopter lifted off, banking steeply before heading southwest toward Kalispell. Michael stood with his arms around his children, watching until the helicopter disappeared over the treetops, feeling a profound sense of helplessness as his wife was carried away without him. The abrupt silence following the helicopter's departure felt unnatural, broken only by Jason's quiet sobs. Ranger Carver approached them, her expression compassionate but businesslike. "We need to head back now," she said. "It's about a 2-hour hike to the ranger station, and we want to be off this trail well before dusk." Michael nodded, suddenly aware of the passage of time. The bear attack had occurred shortly after 2 o'clock. It was now approaching 4:30. By the time they reached the ranger station, Susan would already be at the hospital, possibly in surgery. "What about our things?" Emma asked. Practical even in crisis. Their picnic supplies remained scattered across the clearing, including the blood-stained blanket where her mother had been attacked. "Ranger Martinez will stay behind to collect your belongings and secure the area," Ranger Carver explained. "We'll have everything sent to your accommodation. Right now our priority is getting you safely back to the ranger station." The hike back was surreal, the same trail they had traversed with excitement and anticipation just hours earlier, now transformed into an ordeal to be endured. Ranger Lewis led the way, while Ranger Carver brought up the rear, both rangers remaining vigilant for wildlife. Michael walked between them with the children, one hand holding Jason's and the other resting on Emma's shoulder, the physical connection offering mutual comfort. They maintained a steady pace, stopping only once for a brief water break. The children were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but neither complained. Michael found himself in a state of hyper-awareness, every rustle in the underbrush triggering a surge of adrenaline, his body primed to defend his children against threats that existed primarily in his imagination. By the time they reached the main ranger station near the west entrance, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Inside, they were met by the chief ranger, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard, who introduced himself as Ranger Sullivan. "We've arranged for a park service vehicle to transport you to Kalispell Regional," he informed Michael. "It's ready, whenever you are. We've also contacted your accommodation to let them know about the situation." Michael thanked him, then asked the question that had been forming in his mind during the long hike back. "The bear, will you try to find it?" Ranger Sullivan nodded, his expression grave. "We've already sent out a team to locate and identify the animal based on your description. Once identified, protocol requires that a bear involved in a predatory attack on humans be removed from the population." The euphemism wasn't lost on Michael, but he found he had no emotional capacity to feel anything about the bear's fate. His concern was focused on Susan and on navigating the next hours and days with 2 traumatized children. A young female ranger offered to stay with Emma and Jason, while Michael spoke privately with Ranger Sullivan, providing additional details about the attack for the official incident report. Michael described everything he could remember: the bear's size and behavior, the effectiveness of the bear spray, the sequence of events, while the ranger took detailed notes. "You did everything right," Ranger Sullivan assured him after hearing the account. "You were prepared, you had bear spray, you knew how to use it. This was an unfortunate encounter, but your actions likely prevented a more tragic outcome." The words offered little comfort to Michael, who couldn't shake the image of Susan's bloodied body or the sound of her scream when the bear's teeth pierced her shoulder. If they had done everything right, why was his wife being airlifted to a trauma center? Why were his children sitting shell-shocked in the next room, their vacation transformed into a nightmare? "I'd like to get to the hospital now," he said, standing abruptly. "Is there any update on my wife's condition?" "The hospital has been in contact," Ranger Sullivan replied. "She's in surgery, that's all the information they provided. The drive to Kalispell is about an hour. Ranger Patel will take you." Ranger Patel turned out to be a petite woman with a calm, efficient manner who helped settle the children in the back seat of the Park Service SUV before holding the front passenger door open for Michael. As they pulled away from the ranger station, Michael felt a strange reluctance, as though leaving the park somehow meant leaving Susan behind. It was irrational. She was already at the hospital miles away, but the feeling persisted nonetheless. The drive to Kalispell passed in near silence. Emma and Jason had finally succumbed to exhaustion, both falling asleep despite the uncomfortable circumstances. Michael stared out the window as darkness fell, transforming the spectacular mountain scenery into indistinct shadows. Ranger Patel made no attempt at conversation beyond a few practical questions about whether they needed to stop for any reason. Seeming to understand Michael's need for mental space, they reached Kalispell Regional Medical Center shortly after 8 o'clock. Ranger Patel helped wake the children and guided the family to the emergency department entrance, where she spoke briefly with the reception staff before returning to Michael. "They're expecting you," she said. "I'll wait until you get some news about your wife. If you need anything, a place to stay tonight, help retrieving items from your cabin, anything at all. The park service will assist." Michael nodded his thanks too drained for words and led his children to the reception desk. The staff member, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, immediately stood. "Mr. Roberts, I'm Nancy. We've been expecting you. Your wife is still in surgery, but I'll take you to the surgical waiting area where you can speak with the doctor when they're available." She led them through a labyrinth of corridors to a small private waiting room equipped with comfortable chairs, a coffee machine, and a small refrigerator stocked with juice boxes and snacks. A child-sized table in the corner held coloring, books and crayons, a thoughtful touch that indicated the hospital's experience with families in crisis. "The surgical team has been notified that you've arrived," Nancy told them. "Someone will come speak with you as soon as there's information to share. In the meantime, please help yourselves to refreshments. The bathroom is just down the hall to the right." Left alone, Michael mechanically performed the tasks of basic care, getting juice for the children, helping Jason wash his hands, finding a blanket in a cupboard for Emma, who complained of being cold despite the warm evening. These simple actions helped ground him, providing a temporary focus that kept him from dwelling on what might be happening in the operating room. It was nearly 10 o'clock when a surgeon finally appeared, still wearing scrubs with a surgical cap covering his hair. He introduced himself as Dr. Ramirez, gesturing for Michael to step outside the waiting room for a private conversation. Michael hesitated, looking at the children. "I can stay with them," offered a nurse who had appeared beside the doctor. "Take your time." In the hallway, Dr. Ramirez got straight to the point. "Your wife is stable. The injuries were serious but not life-threatening. The shoulder wound required the most attention. The bear's teeth damaged muscle tissue and partially dislocated the joint, but we were able to repair the damage. She'll need physical therapy, but we expect a good recovery of function." Michael leaned against the wall, relief making his knees weak. "And her leg. Multiple puncture wounds that we've cleaned, debrided and sutured. No major vascular or nerve damage there, fortunately. We've started her on broad-spectrum antibiotics. Infection is the biggest concern with animal bites, especially ones this extensive. When can I see her?" "She's in recovery now. Once she's moved to a room you can go in, probably another hour or so. She'll be groggy from the anesthesia and on significant pain medication, so don't expect much coherent conversation tonight." Michael nodded, processing the information. "What about the children? Can they see her?" Dr. Ramirez considered for a moment. "A brief visit should be fine, but I'd recommend you see her first and prepare them for what to expect. The bandages, the IV lines, the monitoring equipment. It can be frightening for children to see a parent in that state." "And how long will she be here?" "At least 3 days, possibly longer, depending on how the wounds heal and whether any infection develops. Bear bites are notorious for infection risk due to the bacteria present in their mouths." 3 days. Michael mentally calculated what this meant for their vacation plans, their flights home, their work obligations, then immediately chastised himself for such practical concerns when Susan was lying in a recovery room with wounds. That would have been fatal if the bear had been more determined or if help had arrived later. "Thank you," he told the surgeon, extending his hand, "for everything." Dr. Ramirez shook his hand firmly. "Your wife is strong. The nurse will come get you when she's settled in her room." Michael returned to the waiting room where Emma and Jason had fallen asleep again. Emma in a chair with her head at an awkward angle, Jason curled on a small sofa with his head on a cushion. The nurse had covered them both with blankets. "They're good kids," she said quietly. "They've been through a lot today." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "Can they stay here while I see my wife? I don't want to wake them unless I have to." "Of course, I'll stay with them until you return." It was nearly 11 when the nurse finally came to take Michael to Susan's room. He followed her through more corridors to the surgical floor, where she led him to a private room. Before opening the door, she paused. "Just so you're prepared, she has a lot of monitoring equipment, and her appearance may be startling. The shoulder is heavily bandaged, and there's significant bruising visible on her face and neck from the impact and struggle." Michael appreciated the warning, but found that nothing could have truly prepared him for the sight of Susan in the hospital bed. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the white sheets and the medical equipment surrounding her. Her face was indeed bruised, one eye swollen shut, with additional bruising extending down her neck. Her left shoulder was immobilized in a complex bandage system, and an IV line ran into her right arm. A blood pressure cuff was wrapped around her upper arm, inflating periodically with a soft whirring sound. Despite the nurse's warning that Susan would be heavily sedated, her good eye opened as Michael approached the bed. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by immediate concern. "The kids?" she whispered. her voice rough from the intubation tube used during surgery. "They're fine," Michael assured her, carefully taking her hand. "Asleep in the waiting room, not a scratch on either of them." Relief softened her features, and she closed her eye briefly before opening it again. "The bear? Gone. The Rangers are looking for it." He didn't share what Ranger Sullivan had told him about the bear's likely fate, not wanting to add any emotional burden to her current state. "It was so fast," Susan murmured, her words slightly slurred. "1 minute everything was perfect, and then—" "Try not to talk too much," Michael advised, stroking her hand. "You need to rest. The doctor said you're going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay." She gave a slight nod, wincing at even that small movement. "Stay. I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "The kids and I will get a hotel room nearby and we'll be here every day until you're released." Susan's eye drifted closed, the medication pulling her back towards sleep. Michael sat beside her, still holding her hand, watching the steady rise, hand fall of her chest and listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, each sound a reassurance that she was alive, that the day's events, while traumatic, had not resulted in the worst possible outcome. He must have dozed off in the chair because he woke to a gentle touch on his shoulder. The night nurse was standing beside him, checking Susan's vital signs. "There's a cot being set up in the waiting room for you," she told him quietly. "Your children are still asleep. You should get some rest yourself." Michael nodded, stiff from sleeping in the chair. He leaned over to place a gentle kiss on Susan's forehead, before following the nurse back to the waiting room. Emma and Jason hadn't moved, still lost in the deep sleep of emotional and physical exhaustion. The promised cot had been set up in a corner, complete with sheets, a blanket, and a pillow. Michael sat on its edge, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day, the adrenaline that had sustained him finally ebbing to leave bone-deep fatigue in its wake. He removed his shoes and lay down, not bothering to undress further, and was asleep within moments. Morning arrived with the disorienting confusion that follows sleeping in an unfamiliar place. For a few blissful seconds, Michael didn't remember where he was or why. Then the memories flooded back. The bear, Susan's scream, the helicopter lifting away with his wife inside. He sat up abruptly, glancing around the waiting room. Emma and Jason were still asleep, but had shifted positions. During the night, a different nurse sat at a small desk near the door, looking up from her paperwork as he stirred. "Good morning," she said softly. "There's coffee in the pot, and I can have breakfast trays brought up for you and your children when they wake." Michael checked his watch, 6:30. "Thank you. Has there been any update on my wife, Susan Roberts?" The nurse consulted a tablet. She had a comfortable night, vital signs stable, no fever, which is a good sign. "Dr. Ramirez will be making rounds. At 8 if you'd like to speak with him then." Michael nodded, standing and stretching his stiff muscles. The cot had been better than nothing, but far from comfortable. "Is there somewhere I can shower and change?" "There's a family care room down the hall with shower facilities. If you need fresh clothes, the gift shop should open at 7, or there's a Target about 10 minutes away by car." Fresh clothes. Michael suddenly realized they had nothing with them. No change of clothes, no toiletries, no phones or wallets, beyond the basics he'd carried in his pockets during the hike. Their belongings were either back at the cabin or with Ranger Martinez, who had stayed behind to clean up the picnic. "Sight," the nurse, seeing his expression, added, "The park rangers brought a bag for you last night after you were already asleep. It's behind the desk." Sure enough, a duffel bag sat on the floor behind the nurse's station. Inside, Michael found a change of clothes for each of them, their toiletries from the cabin bathroom, his wallet and phone, and a note from Ranger Carver explaining that they had accessed the family's cabin using the emergency key. The note also provided contact information and an assurance that the Park Service would assist with any needs during their stay in Kalispell. By the time Emma and Jason woke around 7, Michael had showered and changed, feeling marginally more human. He helped the children wash up and change into fresh clothes, then supervised as they picked at the breakfast trays the hospital had provided: toast, cereal, fruit cups, and juice boxes that went largely untouched. "When can we see Mom?" Emma asked, pushing her cereal bowl away. "Soon," Michael promised. "The doctor is going to check on her this morning and then we can visit. She was awake last night when I saw her, but very tired from the surgery." "Is she going to be okay?" Jason's voice was small, his eyes wide with worry that no 7-year-old should have to experience. Michael pulled his son onto his lap, wrapping him in a secure embrace. "Yes, she's going to be fine. The doctor fixed her injuries and she'll need to stay in the hospital for a few days to make sure everything is healing properly, but then she'll be much better." "Will she have scars?" Emma asked, always the practical one, seeking concrete information to process the situation. Probably yes, Michael answered honestly, but scars are just reminders that we're strong enough to heal from something difficult. At my 8 o'clock, as promised, Dr. Ramirez arrived to speak with Michael. His expression was cautiously optimistic as he reported on Susan's condition. The night went well, no signs of infection so far, though we'll continue monitoring closely. Pain is being managed effectively. We're going to start some very gentle range of motion exercises for the shoulder today. Nothing strenuous, just enough to prevent stiffness. She's asked to see her children, if you think they're ready. Michael glanced at Emma and Jason, who had been listening intently to the doctor's report. They're ready. I've explained about the bandages and equipment. Dr. Ramirez nodded. Keep the first visit brief, 15 minutes or so. She's still very fatigued, and while seeing her family will be good for her spirits, too much excitement isn't advisable at this stage. The children were subdued as they followed Michael to Susan's room, holding hands as they often did in unfamiliar or stressful situations. Michael paused outside the door, kneeling down to their level. Remember what I told you. Mom has bandages on her shoulder and leg, and there's equipment helping the doctors monitor her condition. She might look a little different because of bruising, but it's still Mom and she's getting better. Emma nodded solemnly while Jason bit his lip, visibly steeling himself. Michael opened the door, letting them enter first while he followed close behind. Susan was sitting up slightly, the head of her bed elevated to a comfortable angle. She looked better than she had the previous night, less pale, more present, though the bruising on her face had darkened to a concerning purple-black that made Jason hesitate mid-step. "Hey, my brave explorers," Susan said, her voice stronger, though still raspy. She extended her uninjured arm toward them. "I'm so proud of you both." The simple gesture and familiar greeting broke through their hesitation. Emma approached first, carefully taking her mother's hand, mindful of the IV line. Jason followed, pressing against his sister's side. "Does it hurt bad?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the bruising around her face. "It did, but the doctors have given me medicine that helps a lot," Susan answered, squeezing Emma's hand while smiling reassuringly at Jason. "And every day it will hurt less, until eventually it won't hurt at all." "Dad said you have to stay here for a few days," Emma said. "What about our vacation?" Susan exchanged a glance with Michael over the children's heads. They hadn't discussed this yet, but the answer seemed obvious to both of them. "We'll need to adjust our plans," Susan said carefully. "Some activities will have to wait for another trip." "Are we going home early?" Jason asked, disappointment evident in his voice despite the circumstances. Michael moved closer, placing his hands on the children's shoulders. "We haven't decided yet. It depends on how Mom feels and what the doctors recommend, but we're all safe and that's what matters most." The brief family reunion continued for about 10 minutes, with the conversation carefully steered toward neutral topics. Whether the hospital food was as bad as TV shows suggested it was, whether the Rangers had retrieved their belongings from the picnic site they had, and what hotel they might stay in while Susan was hospitalized. The Hampton Inn near the hospital had been recommended by the nursing staff. When Susan began showing signs of fatigue, Michael gently suggested that the children return to the waiting room with the nurse so that he could speak privately with their mother. Once they had left, he sat on the edge of the bed, finally able to ask the questions he'd been holding back. "How bad is it, really? Don't downplay it for my sake." Susan shifted slightly, wincing despite the pain medication. "It's pretty bad." "Michael, Dr. Ramirez says I was lucky. The shoulder injury could have been much worse if the bear had shaken its head or pulled harder. As it is, I'll need extensive physical therapy, and there may be some permanent limitation of movement. And the leg. Less serious, structurally speaking, but they're worried about infection. Bear mouths are apparently cesspools of bacteria." She attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "If infection sets in, it could mean more surgery, longer hospitalization, possibly even more significant tissue loss." Michael absorbed this information, his jaw tight. "I should have been there. I shouldn't have left you alone with the kids." "Don't," Susan said firmly despite her weakened state. "Don't do that to yourself. You couldn't have known. And you came back. You saved us." "The bear spray saved you," Michael corrected. "If we hadn't had it, if the Rangers hadn't emphasized its importance during orientation, then we would have found ourselves in the exact same situation, just without an effective tool," Susan finished for him. "Michael, we did everything right. Sometimes nature just doesn't care about human precautions." They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating how quickly their carefully planned vacation had transformed into a nightmare that would have lasting consequences. "What do you want to do?" Michael finally asked, About the rest of the trip, I mean. Our return flight isn't for 5 more days. You'll still be here for at least 3 of those. Susan considered. I don't want the kids' only memory of Glacier to be this. I don't want them to be afraid of nature or national parks or bears for the rest of their lives. She paused, gathering her thoughts. If the doctors say it's okay, I think we should stay until our scheduled departure. Maybe adjust the last couple of days to include activities I can participate in, even with limited mobility. Michael was surprised. You want to continue the vacation? After what happened? Not exactly the same vacation we planned, Susan clarified. But yes, I want us to reclaim some part of this experience for the kids and for us. Otherwise, this becomes the defining moment of our relationship with wild places, and I can't accept that. It was such a quintessentially Susan response that Michael felt a surge of love for his wife despite, or perhaps because of, the circumstances. Her capacity to look beyond immediate trauma to the broader impact on their family's future was what had drawn him to her from the beginning. Okay, he agreed. If the doctors approve, we'll stay. But the priority is your recovery, not salvaging the vacation. Susan nodded, then closed her eyes briefly, fatigue evident in every line of her face. You should take the kids out today. Get them away from the hospital, do something normal. There's no reason for all of you to sit around here watching me sleep. I don't want to leave you, Michael protested. I'll be fine, surrounded by medical professionals and mostly unconscious anyway. She squeezed his hand weakly. The kids need some normalcy, Michael, and frankly, so do you. You can't sit here staring at me with that worried expression for 3 straight days. Michael knew she was right, though the thought of leaving her, even in the safe environment of the hospital, triggered a visceral response after the trauma of their separation during the evacuation. Still, the children needed attention and distraction, and sitting in a hospital waiting room would only reinforce the traumatic aspects of their experience. All right, he conceded. I'll find something for us to do today, but we'll be back this evening and I'll stay tonight. Of course you will, Susan said with a hint of her usual dry humor. You're much too responsible to do otherwise. A nurse entered to check Susan's vital signs, signaling the end of their private conversation. Michael kissed her, gently, mindful of her bruises, before leaving to rejoin the children in the waiting room. The rest of the day passed in a blur of practical arrangements. Michael secured a room at the Hampton Inn, just a 5-minute drive from the hospital. They visited a nearby shopping center to purchase a few additional clothing items and some books and small toys to occupy the children during hospital visits. At Emma's insistence, they bought a journal for Susan, thinking she might want to record her thoughts and experiences during recovery. In the afternoon, following Susan's advice to provide normalcy, Michael took the children to a small local museum with interactive exhibits about Montana's natural history. Initially reluctant to engage, Emma and Jason gradually became absorbed in the displays about glaciers, wildlife, and regional geology. The museum was small enough to feel manageable in their emotionally fragile state, and the educational content provided a structured way to process some of what they had experienced without directly addressing the attack. They returned to the hospital for dinner, bringing takeout food that they ate in Susan's room during a visit that was more relaxed than the morning's emotional encounter. Susan was sitting more upright, her color improved, and while pain was evident in the tightness around her eyes, she made a visible effort to engage with the children's accounts of their day. When Susan began showing signs of fatigue, Michael sent the children to the waiting room with a nurse while he discussed the next day's plan with his wife. The Rangers called, he told her. They want to take my statement in person, and they asked if the children would be willing to talk about what they saw as well. Nothing formal or intimidating, just to complete their incident report. Susan nodded. That makes sense. Do you think the kids are ready for that? Emma probably is. She's been processing everything in that analytical way of hers, asking lots of questions about bear behavior and park protocols. Jason is more fragile. He had a nightmare last night. About the bear? Michael nodded. He woke up crying, saying it was coming for you again and he couldn't help. I managed to calm him down without waking Emma, but he's definitely carrying some trauma. Susan sighed. Maybe talking to the Rangers would be good for him, actually. They're experts. They can reassure him in ways we can't about how rare these incidents are, how the bear was likely just being a bear, not some monster out to get his mom specifically. I'll see how he feels tomorrow, Michael agreed. The Rangers are coming here to the hospital, so you'll be nearby if he needs reassurance. The next day brought the promised visit from Ranger Carver and Ranger Sullivan. They spoke with Michael first, reviewing his written statement and asking clarifying questions about the sequence of events, the bear's behavior, and the effectiveness of their defensive measures. Michael appreciated their professionalism and the matter-of-fact way they discussed the incident, neither sensationalizing the attack nor dismissing its seriousness. Emma volunteered to speak with the Rangers next, her account impressively detailed for a 10-year-old. She described the bear's approach, her mother's instructions, and the terrifying moments during and after the attack, with a clarity that both impressed and concerned the adults listening. "You have an excellent memory," Ranger Carver told her when she finished. "That will be very helpful to you in life, though sometimes after scary experiences, it can also mean the memories stay very clear when you might wish they would fade a bit." Emma considered this thoughtfully. "Is that what happens to you? When you have to deal with emergencies in the park?" Ranger Carver nodded. "Sometimes, but I've learned that talking about those experiences, like you're doing now, can help make them less frightening over time." When it was Jason's turn, he initially clung to Michael, unwilling to speak about what he had seen. Ranger Sullivan, showing remarkable sensitivity for a man with his gruff exterior, knelt down to the boy's level. "You know, when I was just a little older than you, maybe 9 or 10, I had a scary encounter with a moose," he began, his voice conversational rather than condescending. "Not a bear, but moose can be dangerous too. Want to hear about it?" Jason nodded hesitantly, his curiosity piqued despite his anxiety. Ranger Sullivan proceeded to tell a story about a childhood camping trip where a moose had wandered into their campsite, causing his father to usher the family into their car. For safety, he described his fear, his concern for his younger sister, and the mixed feelings of terror and fascination he had experienced. "I used to have nightmares about that moose," the ranger admitted, "but then I learned more about moose behavior, about why they do what they do, and the nightmares stopped. The moose wasn't trying to hurt us, it was just being a moose in moose territory, which happened to overlap with where we humans were visiting." Jason absorbed this, then asked the question that had clearly been troubling him. "Did you find the bear that hurt my mom?" The rangers exchanged glances before Ranger Sullivan answered carefully. "We identified a young male grizzly in that area, with evidence that it had been sprayed with bear deterrent. Based on the tracks and other signs, we believe it was the bear involved in the incident." "Did you kill it?" Jason's voice was small, but direct. Another pause, then Ranger Sullivan answered honestly, "No, we didn't. After examining the evidence and reviewing the accounts of what happened, wildlife management determined that this was not a predatory attack. The bear was not hunting your family for food. It was more likely a surprise encounter, where the bear felt threatened or was investigating the picnic area for food scraps. In cases like this, especially in a national park, where wildlife conservation is part of our mission, we don't automatically destroy the animal." Jason seemed surprised by this answer, perhaps having expected a more retributive approach. "So it's still out there? The same bear that hurt Mom?" "Yes, but with an important difference," Ranger Carver interjected. "That bear has now had a negative experience with humans. It got a face full of pepper spray twice. Bears are intelligent animals that learn from experiences like that. It's very likely that this bear will be more cautious around humans in the future, maybe even avoiding them entirely. Like when I touched the hot stove, even though Mom told me not to, and then I never did it again because I learned it hurts," Jason suggested, making a connection that caused the adults to smile despite the serious subject. "That's a very good comparison," Ranger Sullivan agreed. "Bears learn from painful experiences, just like people do." This explanation seemed to satisfy Jason, who proceeded to answer the ranger's gentle questions about what he had seen and heard during the attack. His account was less detailed than Emma's, but added a few observations from a different perspective, including the bear's vocalizations when struck by the bear spray and its behavior during retreat. When the rangers had finished gathering information, they thanked the family and provided them with a case number for the official incident report, explaining that it would be available through the Park Service if needed for insurance claims or medical documentation. Before leaving, they also delivered an update on the family's belongings. Everything from their picnic site had been collected, cleaned as well as possible, and would be delivered to their cabin later that day. "What about our scheduled activities for the rest of our stay?" Michael asked. "Obviously, we'll need to cancel or modify most of them." "The Park's Visitor Services Office has been notified of your situation," Ranger Carver assured him. "They'll work with you to adjust reservations or provide refunds as needed. And when Mrs. Roberts is discharged, please know that there are many ways to experience the park that don't require strenuous activity or remote locations." The ranger's visit had taken most of the morning. After lunch, Dr. Ramirez examined Susan and reported continued improvement, No signs of infection, stable vital signs, and good initial response to the gentle physical therapy that had been started for her shoulder. If this progress continues, discharge on Friday morning is realistic, he informed them. You'll need to continue antibiotics, manage pain medication, and follow up with wound care and physical therapy, but those can be arranged either here in Kalispell if you're staying in the area, or coordinated with providers back home if you're returning directly. We have a flight back to Minneapolis on Sunday evening, Michael explained. Susan would like to complete the remainder of our planned vacation with modifications if you think that's medically reasonable. Dr. Ramirez considered this, reviewing Susan's chart. I don't see why not with appropriate precautions. No hiking, obviously. The shoulder should remain immobilized, and the leg wounds need to be kept clean and dry. Daily wound checks and dressing changes will be necessary. The main concerns would be preventing infection and managing pain while traveling. He made some notes before continuing. I'll prescribe a portable pain management regimen and provide detailed wound care instructions. You'll need to be vigilant about monitoring for signs of infection, increased redness, warmth, swelling, or fever. At the first sign of any of those, you'd need to seek immediate medical attention. The prospect of Susan's discharge brought both relief and anxiety for Michael, while he wanted nothing more than to have his family reunited outside the sterile hospital environment. He also recognized the responsibility of managing Susan's medical needs while simultaneously caring for two children still processing their traumatic experience. The remainder of the day passed quietly, with Susan resting while Michael researched modified activities they might enjoy during their remaining time in Montana. By evening, he had compiled a list of options: scenic drives through the park, a boat tour on Lake McDonald where Susan could remain seated comfortably, wildlife viewing from roadside pullouts, and a visit to the park's main visitor center with its accessible educational exhibits. On Thursday morning, Michael took the children back to their cabin at Glacier National Park to collect their belongings and check out. Ranger Martinez met them there, having prepared the cabin for their departure and organized their luggage. The picnic items had been cleaned as promised, though Michael noted that the plaid blanket was missing, likely too damaged or blood-stained to be salvageable. Walking through the cabin, gathering toiletries and checking drawers for overlooked items, Michael was struck by how distant their arrival just 5 days earlier seemed. The excited family that had unpacked in this space, full of anticipation for their wilderness adventure, felt like strangers to him now. "Dad," Emma called from the small porch. "Come look." He joined her outside, where she was pointing to a bulletin board near the cabin cluster's common area. A new notice had been posted. Wildlife alert. Recent bear encounter reported in Reynolds Creek area. Visitors advised to use extreme caution, travel in groups, carry bear spray, and make noise when hiking. See Ranger Station for additional information and safety guidelines. The clinical language of the notice: bear encounter rather than violent attack, extreme caution rather than avoid the area entirely, struck Michael as oddly sanitized, though he understood the Park Service's need to balance public safety with their mission of promoting wildlife appreciation. "That's about Mom, isn't it?" Emma asked, her voice matter-of-fact. Michael nodded. "Yes, they have to warn other visitors." Emma studied the notice for a moment longer. "It doesn't say how bad it was." "No, it doesn't," Michael agreed, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "That's probably deliberate. They want people to be careful without causing panic." "But people should know," Emma insisted. "They should know what can happen even if you do everything right." Her words echoed his own thoughts from the conversation with Ranger Sullivan. How could they have prevented this? What had they missed? But the uncomfortable truth was emerging. Sometimes, despite every precaution, despite following every guideline, nature operated on its own terms, indifferent to human intentions or preparations. They finished packing the car and checked out of the cabin, stopping at the visitor center to cancel their remaining scheduled activities. The staff were unfailingly sympathetic, having been briefed on the situation, and processed the cancellations and refunds without the usual bureaucratic complications. One older staff member, who introduced herself as a volunteer who had worked at the park for over 20 years, spoke with Michael privately. "I just wanted to say how sorry I am about what happened to your wife," she said, her weathered face creased with genuine concern. "I've been here long enough to see a few bear incidents, and they're always frightening, but I've also seen how people respond afterward, and it often defines their relationship with wild places going forward." Michael nodded, appreciating her directness. "My wife said something similar. She doesn't want this to be the defining experience of our family's relationship with nature." The woman smiled. "She sounds like a wise woman. Some visitors never return after an encounter like yours, and that's a valid response. Others become crusaders for better safety measures or more aggressive wildlife management. But the ones who seem to find the most peace are those who somehow integrate the experience into a bigger understanding of what it means to share the planet with wild creatures, not minimizing the trauma, but not letting it define everything either." It was perhaps the most helpful perspective Michael had heard since the attack, an acknowledgement of the trauma's significance paired with a gentle suggestion that there might be a path forward that neither denied nor was consumed by the experience. They returned to Kalispell by early afternoon, visiting Susan at the hospital to share their progress and discuss plans for her discharge the following day. The hotel had upgraded them to a suite at no additional charge after learning of their situation, providing a separate bedroom where Susan could rest comfortably away from the children's activities. Friday morning brought Susan's discharge, a process that took several hours as Dr. Ramirez and his team reviewed medication schedules, wound care procedures, physical therapy exercises, and warning signs that would necessitate immediate medical attention. The shoulder wound remained the primary concern, requiring a specialized dressing that would need daily changes performed by Michael under telehealth supervision for the first few days. Susan left the hospital in a wheelchair, hospital policy, despite her insistence that she could walk with assistance. The leg wound, while less structurally significant than the shoulder injury, made walking painful and created a risk of reopening the sutured punctures. She was helped into the front passenger seat of their rental car, where Michael had arranged pillows to support her injured shoulder and minimize jostling during the drive. Their first destination as a reunited family was the Hampton Inn, where Susan could rest comfortably before they attempted any activities. The children were noticeably gentler around their mother, Jason unconsciously lowering his voice, and Emma taking on an almost maternal role, offering to help with simple tasks that Susan's injuries made difficult. By late afternoon, Susan felt strong enough for their first modified excursion, a scenic drive along the Going to the Sun Road, the park's famous mountain highway that offered spectacular views from the comfort of their vehicle. They drove at a leisurely pace, stopping at pullouts where particularly stunning vistas presented themselves, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence and other times engaging in conversation that carefully skirted the trauma they were all still processing. At one such pullout, with a panoramic view of the mountains reflected in a pristine alpine lake, Emma broke the unspoken agreement not to directly discuss the attack. "Mom," she began, uncharacteristic hesitation in her voice, "are you angry at the bear?" Susan turned carefully in her seat to look at her daughter. "That's an interesting question. I've been thinking about it a lot. No, I'm not angry at the bear. It was just being a bear, doing what bears do when they're young, hungry, and encounter something unfamiliar." "But it hurt you really bad," Jason interjected from the back seat. "It did," Susan acknowledged, "and that's something I'll have to deal with for a long time, but being angry at the bear would be like being angry at a thunderstorm for lightning that strikes near you. Natural forces aren't malicious, they just are." "I think I'm angry at it," Jason admitted in a small voice. "Is that bad?" "No, sweetie, it's not bad at all," Susan assured him. "You're allowed to feel however you feel. Being angry is a normal response when someone you love gets hurt." Michael, who had been listening silently, added, "Sometimes feelings change over time too. Right now, the scary parts of what happened are still very fresh in our minds. Later, we might feel differently." Emma considered this, then asked the question that had clearly been troubling her. "Will we ever go hiking again, as a family?" The question hung in the air, carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. It was really asking, will we let fear define us? Will our family be forever changed by this? Is this the end of something we valued? Susan and Michael exchanged glances before Susan answered carefully, "Yes, I think we will. Not right away. I'll need time to heal, and we'll all need time to process what happened. But eventually, yes. Nature and wild places are too important to give up entirely, even after something frightening happens. But we'll be even more careful," Michael added, wanting to acknowledge the reality of the risk without amplifying fear. "We'll choose places and times that minimize risks. We'll always carry bear spray. We'll make more noise on the trail. And we'll remember that even with all those precautions, there are no guarantees," Susan finished. "Just like there are no guarantees when we drive on the highway or fly in an airplane. We take reasonable precautions, and then we live our lives accepting that absolute safety doesn't exist. It was perhaps a heavy philosophical concept for the children, but Michael noticed Emma nodding thoughtfully while Jason seemed comforted by the idea that hiking, an activity he had enjoyed tremendously before the attack, might eventually return to their family repertoire. The remainder of their vacation passed in a gentle rhythm of rest and carefully selected activities. They took the boat tour on Lake McDonald, where the captain discreetly arranged comfortable seating for Susan and shared fascinating information about the lake's formation and ecology. They visited the park's main visitor center, where interactive exhibits kept the children engaged, while Susan rested on convenient benches. They drove to wildlife viewing areas during dawn and dusk hours, spotting elk, mountain goats, and even a distant black bear that, somewhat surprisingly, generated excitement rather than fear from all family members. On their last evening in Montana, they ate dinner at a restaurant overlooking Whitefish Lake, about 20 miles from Kalispell. The setting sun painted the sky in dramatic oranges and pinks, reflecting off the water's surface and illuminating the mountains in the distance. Their server, noting Susan's injured state, had arranged a corner table with additional space and privacy, allowing the family to enjoy their meal without navigating the restaurant's crowded central area. As they waited for dessert, Michael raised his water glass in a toast. To survival, resilience, and new perspectives. Susan smiled, raising her own glass with her uninjured arm. And to bears, from a respectful distance. The children giggled at this unexpected addition, tension breaking as they clinked their glasses together. Later, back at the hotel as the children prepared for bed, Susan sat on the small balcony attached to their suite, gazing at the distant mountains now silhouetted against the night sky. Michael joined her, placing a light blanket around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Penny, for your thoughts," he said, sitting in the adjacent chair. "I was just thinking about that bear," Susan replied. "I wonder where it is tonight, what it's doing. Probably just being a bear, looking for food, finding a place to sleep, completely unaware that it's the main character in our family's most dramatic story." Michael nodded, understanding her contemplation of the animal that had so profoundly affected their lives. The rangers said it was young, probably only 3 or 4 years old. "It'll likely live another 15 to 20 years if it stays out of trouble." "I hope it does," Susan said, surprising him. "Stay out of trouble, I mean. I meant what I said at dinner. I don't blame the bear, and I don't want it killed because of what happened." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Susan spoke again. "You know what's strange? When I think about the attack, what I remember most vividly isn't the pain or the fear, though those were certainly intense. It's the bear's eyes. There was such presence in them, intelligence, assessment. It was looking at me as something to be figured out, not just as prey." Michael had no response to this, having not seen the bear's eyes in the same close proximity that Susan had. He simply took her hand, offering silent support as she continued processing the experience in her own way. "I think that's why I'm not consumed by fear or hatred," Susan continued. "In that moment, terrible as it was, there was also a kind of connection. Not a mystical one. I'm not romanticizing a wild animal that nearly killed me, but a recognition that we were two living beings navigating an unexpected encounter, both operating according to our natures." Michael squeezed her hand. "That's a remarkably philosophical take on having your shoulder nearly torn off." Susan laughed softly, then winced as the movement jostled her injured shoulder. "Well, painkillers might be contributing to my philosophical mood, but I mean it. If I'm going to carry physical scars from this for the rest of my life, which I am, then I want to carry something meaningful in my understanding as well." Sunday morning brought departure preparations, checking out of the hotel, returning the rental car, navigating the small Glacier Park International Airport with Susan in a wheelchair and 2 children still somewhat subdued by the events of the week. The airline staff, notified in advance of their situation, provided assistance with boarding and ensured Susan had adequate space for her injured shoulder on the flight to Minneapolis. As their plane lifted off, the children pressed against the window to watch the mountains recede below them. Susan, seated across the aisle due to the configuration of the aircraft, watched her children instead, noting the mixture of reluctance and relief in their expressions as they left Montana behind. "They're going to be okay," Michael said quietly, from the seat beside her. "Kids are resilient." "I know," Susan replied. "I'm just wondering what stories they'll tell about this trip when they're older. What parts will stay with them." The flight home passed uneventfully, Susan sleeping for much of it thanks to her medication, while the children occupied themselves with books and games. Landing in Minneapolis brought the comfort of familiarity, the skyline visible as they descended, the terminal they had departed from just a week earlier, the sounds and rhythms of their home city. Michael's parents met them at the airport, having been informed of the situation through brief phone calls during the week. Their faces registered shock, despite their attempts to appear casual when they first saw Susan's injured state, but they quickly recovered, offering practical assistance with luggage and transportation while avoiding excessive questions or expressions of alarm that might upset the children. The drive to their suburban home passed with general conversation about neighborhood happenings and school preparations for the upcoming year, an unspoken agreement to postpone detailed discussion of the bear attack until the children were not present. When they arrived home, Michael's mother had prepared a simple dinner that awaited them, along with a refrigerator stocked with easy meals for the coming days. After the grandparents departed, and the children were settled in their own beds for the first time in over a week, Susan and Michael sat in their living room, the familiar surroundings creating an almost surreal contrast to the events they had experienced. "It feels strange to be home," Susan admitted, "like the attack happened to someone else in another life." Michael nodded, understanding perfectly. "I keep expecting to wake up and find we're still in the cabin, that the whole thing was just a nightmare. Unfortunately, my shoulder confirms it wasn't." Susan grimaced, adjusting her position on the couch to alleviate pressure on her injury. "I have that telehealth appointment tomorrow for the first dressing change, and I need to call work." Explain the situation. Michael had already contacted his own employer, a brief email explaining the family emergency that would necessitate an additional few days off to help Susan settle at home. Her injuries would require assistance with basic activities for at least several weeks, and they had yet to work out the logistics of managing her care alongside their usual work and family responsibilities. "One day at a time," Michael said, echoing the hospital social worker who had visited before Susan's discharge. "We don't need to figure everything out tonight." The next 2 weeks established a new normal for the Roberts family. Susan's recovery progressed steadily, with no signs of infection developing, and the physical therapy for her shoulder showing promising early results. The children returned to their summer activities. Emma to her science camp, Jason to his swimming lessons, with friends and other parents discreetly informed about the family's experience to explain any unusual behavior or emotional responses. Word of the attack spread through their social and professional circles, leading to a steady stream of visitors bearing casseroles and offering assistance. Susan found herself repeating a sanitized version of the story dozens of times, gradually developing a narrative that acknowledged the trauma without dwelling on the most frightening details. With closer friends, she shared more, sometimes showing the healing wounds that would eventually become scars, physical reminders of an experience that was already changing from raw terror to something more complex in her memory. The children processed the experience in their own ways. Emma researched bear behavior and national park safety protocols, creating a detailed presentation that she delivered to her science camp with surprising poise. Jason worked through his feelings in play, his toy animals enacting scenarios where bears and humans encountered each other, sometimes with conflict, but increasingly with mutual respect and peaceful outcomes. Michael found himself hypervigilant about safety in ways that extended beyond reasonable precautions, checking locks multiple times at night, installing additional security features on their home, and developing contingency plans for everyday outings. A therapist friend gently suggested that this was a normal response to the helplessness he had felt during the attack, and that with time, the intensity of these behaviors would likely diminish. 3 weeks after their return, the official incident report arrived from Glacier National Park. The document, clinical in its language and formatted in bureaucratic style, reduced their life-altering experience to a series of timestamps, location coordinates, and objective descriptions. The bear was identified as a sub-adult male grizzly, approximately 3 to 4 years of age, estimated weight 300–350 pounds. The attack was categorized as a defensive response to perceived threat, and the report noted that defensive measures, bear spray, proved partially effective in terminating the encounter. Susan read the report twice, then filed it away in their home office. The official documentation, while validating the reality of what had happened, felt strangely disconnected from her lived experience. The terror, the pain, the peculiar moment of connection she had felt, looking into the bear's eyes. The report would satisfy insurance companies and medical providers, but it couldn't capture the complex ways in which the attack had altered her perception of herself, of nature, and of her family's place in the world. On the 1-month anniversary of the attack, Susan suggested a family hike at a nearby state park, a flat, well-traveled trail with no recorded bear sightings in the park's history. Michael was hesitant, concerned about her physical readiness and about the psychological impact on the children, but Susan was insistent. "We need to do this," she explained, "not to prove anything or to pretend the attack didn't happen, but precisely because it did happen. This is part of our healing." The hike was brief and uneventful, the late summer day perfect for a gentle outdoor excursion. The children were initially subdued, staying unusually close to their parents on the trail, but gradually relaxed as the familiar pleasures of nature, butterflies landing on wildflowers, a turtle sunning itself on a log, the dappled sunlight through the trees, reminded them of the positive experiences that had always characterized their family outings before the attack. At a scenic overlook, they paused to rest on a convenient bench. Susan, her arm still in a supportive sling, but her leg wound now healed to pink scar tissue, gazed out at the rolling Minnesota landscape, so different from the dramatic peaks of Glacier National Park, yet beautiful in its own right. "I had a dream about the bear last night," she said quietly, not looking at her family but sensing their immediate attention. "Not a nightmare, just a dream. It was moving through the forest, just being a bear. And in the dream, I was watching it from a distance, not afraid, just observing." Michael placed his hand over hers. "That sounds like progress." Susan nodded. "I think it is. The attack will always be part of our story, mine especially." She touched her shoulder where the scars would remain visible for the rest of her life. "But it doesn't have to be the whole story, or even the most important part." Emma, who had been listening intently, asked, "If we go back to Glacier someday, would you go hiking there again?" The question hung in the air, a test of Susan's stated philosophy about integrating rather than being defined by trauma. She considered it carefully before answering. "Yes, I think I would. Not to the same spot, perhaps, and certainly with every possible precaution, but yes, eventually. The mountains were there long before that bear and I had our encounter, and they'll be there long after both of us are gone. They're worth experiencing, even knowing the risks." Jason, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly pointed toward a thicket of bushes along the trail. "Look, a deer." The family turned to see a white-tailed doe cautiously emerging from the vegetation, ears flicking as she assessed the humans on the bench. For a moment, human and deer regarded each other across the space that separated them, wild and domestic, natural and cultivated, connected by their shared presence in that particular moment. Then the doe turned and bounded away, white tail flashing as she disappeared into the forest. Jason's delighted laughter at the sighting broke the contemplative mood, returning them to the simple pleasure of a family outing on a beautiful day. As they continued their walk back to the parking area, Susan found herself considering the strange symmetry of wilderness encounters, the bear that had nearly taken her life, the deer that had brought her son joy. Both were wild animals acting according to their nature, neither good nor evil, but simply alive in the way they were meant to be. The danger and the beauty of such encounters were inextricably linked, one impossible without the other. Her shoulder ached, a persistent reminder of tooth and claw and the fragility of human flesh. But the ache was becoming familiar, integrating into her understanding of herself, just as the attack was integrating into her family's shared history. Not forgotten, not minimized, but also not permitted to overshadow everything that had come before or would come after. In the parking lot, preparing to return to their suburban home with its locks and alarms and artificial boundaries, Susan looked back at the forest edge. No bears lurked there, only squirrels and songbirds and perhaps that same curious doe. Yet she felt a connection to the wilderness that transcended her specific experience, a recognition that human lives and wild lives were separated by thinner margins than most people acknowledged. The bear that had attacked her had simply been a bear, acting according to its nature in a world that humans visited but did not control. In its territory by a creek in Glacier National Park, it was likely continuing its bearish existence, foraging, resting, perhaps occasionally encountering other humans who remained blissfully unaware of how quickly a peaceful afternoon could transform into a fight for survival. Susan got into the car, adjusting her position to accommodate her healing body. As Michael started the engine, she glanced at her children in the back seat, seeing in their faces both the lingering shadows of trauma and the resilience that was gradually overwriting fear with new experiences. They would carry this story with them always, but it would change over time, perspective shifting as they grew and integrated the experience into their understanding of the world. The official report would remain in their file cabinet, the clinical documentation of a bear encounter at Reynolds Creek. Susan's medical records would note animal attack resulting in soft tissue damage to left shoulder and right thigh. Insurance claims would reference wilderness injury requiring helicopter evacuation and surgical intervention. But the truth of what had happened, the complex, terrifying, strangely profound truth, existed only in the memories of those who had experienced it. The bear, walking away from the attack with no concept of its significance to the humans involved, carried no memory of Susan Roberts as an individual, only perhaps an associative wariness of humans and the burning sensation of bear spray. And Susan, driving home with her family on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, carried the bear with her, not as a nightmare or an obsession, but as a reminder of boundaries crossed and survived, of wild nature encountered without mediation, of life continuing after moments when it seemed impossible that it could. Her scars would fade from angry red to pink to silver over time, becoming part of her body's landscape, just as the memory of the attack would become part of her family's emotional landscape, present but not dominant, significant but not defining. What had started as a peaceful family picnic and ended with a helicopter evacuation had become something else entirely, a story they were still writing together, one day at a time.